Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The diesel fumes hung thick in the humid South Texas air as Boaz Kincannon finished his pre-trip inspection under the sodium lights of the Laredo Freight Depot. It was just past 10 on a Thursday night, late September, and the temperature still hovered somewhere in the low 80s. Sweat already darkened the collar of his work shirt, and he hadn't even climbed into the cab yet. 15 years hauling freight along the border routes had taught him that autumn in South Texas was a cruel joke. The seasons changed everywhere else in the country, but down here, heat was a constant companion that only loosened its grip for a few precious weeks in January. He'd drawn a straightforward run tonight, at least on paper. A refrigerated load of produce from a distributor just outside Laredo, bound for a warehouse in McAllen, about 140 miles southeast along US 83. The route hugged the Rio Grande for most of the journey, cutting through mesquite flats and ranch land that hadn't changed much since the days of cattle drives. It was familiar territory, the kind of run Boaz could do half asleep. He'd made this trip dozens of times, knew every truck stop, every border patrol checkpoint, every stretch where the road narrowed and the shoulders disappeared into caliche dust. The paperwork had come through clean. Bill of lading listed mixed vegetables, tomatoes, peppers, onions, all standard stuff moving up from Mexican farms through the Laredo crossing. The seals on the trailer were intact, numbers matching the manifest exactly. Boaz had checked them twice, running his flashlight beam over the heavy-duty locks that secured the rear doors. Everything looked legitimate, and that should have been reassuring. But something about the way the dispatcher had handed him the clipboard earlier made him pause. The man had avoided eye contact, shuffling papers on his desk with unusual intensity, and when Boaz asked about the shipper, he'd gotten a vague answer about a new client, someone looking to establish a regular route. Boaz climbed into the cab of his Peterbilt 579, settling into the worn driver's seat that had molded itself to his frame over the years. The interior smelled like stale coffee, diesel, and the faint chemical tang of the air freshener dangling from the rearview mirror. He adjusted his mirrors, checked his gauges, and pulled the air brake release. The truck responded with its familiar hiss and rumble, engine settling into a steady idle that vibrated through the floorboards. He reached for his thermos, still half full of lukewarm coffee from the morning, and took a long sip. The bitterness cut through the humidity, sharpening his focus. The gate attendant waved him through without a second glance, and Boaz guided the rig out onto the access road, merging carefully onto the southbound lanes. Traffic was light at this hour, mostly other commercial trucks heading toward the valley or up toward San Antonio. The highway stretched ahead in a ribbon of cracked asphalt, illuminated in patches by the occasional streetlight before giving way to long stretches of darkness. On either side, the landscape flattened into scrubland dotted with mesquite and huisac, their twisted silhouettes barely visible against the night sky. Boaz had always liked night driving. There was a rhythm to it, a meditative quality that came from hours alone with the road and your thoughts. The radio chatter on the CB was minimal tonight, just a few truckers exchanging information about traffic backups and weather conditions further north. He kept the volume low, preferring the steady hum of the engine and the whisper of tires on pavement. His mind wandered to practical things, the payment he'd receive at the end of this run, the truck maintenance he'd been putting off, the visit he owed his sister up in Corpus Christi. About 20 miles south of Laredo, he passed the first Border Patrol checkpoint. It was a permanent installation, a cluster of white and green vehicles parked beneath blazing floodlights, with agents in their distinctive uniforms directing traffic into inspection lanes. Boaz slowed as he approached, rolling down his window and reaching for his commercial driver's license and the manifest folder. The agent who stepped up to his cab was young, maybe mid-20s, with a crisp uniform and the kind of intensity that suggested he was still new to the job. The agent glanced at Boaz's documents, then walked around to the rear of the trailer, checking the seals. Boaz watched in his side mirror, noting the deliberate way the agent examined each lock, comparing the numbers to something on his clipboard. After a moment, the agent returned to the cab window and handed back the paperwork. His expression was neutral, professional, but there was something in his eyes that made Boaz uneasy. A flicker of recognition, maybe, or suspicion. "You're clear to proceed," the agent said, stepping back. "Drive safe." Boaz nodded, rolling up the window and easing the truck forward. In his mirror, he saw the agent watching him pull away, still holding his clipboard, not moving to inspect the next vehicle in line. It was probably nothing, just routine caution. But it added another small weight to the vague discomfort that had been building since he'd picked up this load. He shook it off and focused on the road ahead, letting the familiar landscape settle his nerves. The highway continued southeast, parallel to the river he couldn't see but knew was there, just beyond the brush and the ranches. Out here, the border wasn't a wall or a fence in most places, just the natural barrier of the Rio Grande, winding through terrain that looked the same on both sides. The real border was more complicated, a patchwork of jurisdictions and enforcement zones, cameras and sensors buried in the dirt, agents patrolling in vehicles with night vision equipment. Boaz had learned long ago not to think too hard about what crossed back and forth out here. His job was to haul legitimate freight, keep his paperwork clean, and stay out of trouble. 40 miles into the run, just past the tiny crossroads of Zapata, he noticed the first irregularity. A white SUV had been pacing him for the last several minutes, staying about a quarter-mile back, matching his speed exactly. It wasn't unusual to have vehicles follow a truck on these empty highways, using the rig's taillights as a guide through the darkness. But something about this one felt different. The headlights were too bright, almost blinding in his mirrors, and the vehicle never varied its distance. When Boaz slowed to 60, it slowed. When he sped up to 70, it kept perfect pace. He tried changing lanes, drifting into the left lane for a few miles before moving back to the right. The SUV followed every maneuver, maintaining that same precise distance. Boaz felt his jaw tighten, muscles tensing across his shoulders. He reached for the CB mic, considering calling out to see if any other drivers had noticed the tail, but decided against it. Drawing attention to himself seemed like a bad idea, especially with a load he was already uncertain about. The white SUV stayed with him all the way through Zapata, past the reservoir that reflected moonlight in broken silver fragments, past the shuttered gas stations and darkened ranch houses. Boaz kept his eyes flicking between the road ahead and the mirrors, watching that unwavering set of headlights. His mind ran through possibilities. Law enforcement running surveillance, maybe, though they usually weren't this obvious. Or someone connected to the cargo, tracking the shipment. Neither option was comforting. Just south of Falcon Heights, the SUV suddenly accelerated, closing the distance rapidly. Boaz's pulse quickened, his hand instinctively moving towards the Glock he kept secured beneath the driver's seat. But instead of pulling alongside or attempting to force him off the road, the SUV swept past in the left lane, engine roaring, and disappeared into the darkness ahead. Boaz caught only a glimpse of tinted windows and a license plate too blurred by speed to read. Within seconds, the taillights were gone, swallowed by the night. He exhaled slowly, realizing he'd been holding his breath. The highway stretched empty again, just his rig and the endless asphalt and the invisible river somewhere to his right. But the tension in his chest wouldn't ease. That SUV hadn't been random. Someone had been watching, evaluating, maybe confirming something about his route or his cargo. The thought made his skin crawl. Boaz pushed on, counting down the miles to McAllen. The refrigeration unit on his trailer hummed steadily, the sound a familiar constant that usually provided comfort. Tonight it felt ominous, a reminder that he was hauling something that needed to stay cold, something that someone might be very interested in. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles pale in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. Around 1 in the morning, he approached the outskirts of Rio Grande City. The town was small, quiet at this hour, with most businesses shuttered and streetlights casting weak yellow pools across empty intersections. Boaz had planned to stop for fuel here, but as he took the exit ramp, he noticed another vehicle in his mirrors, a dark pickup truck moving onto the ramp behind him. It could have been coincidence. This was the main exit for anyone heading into town. But after the white SUV, his nerves were raw, and he found himself questioning every vehicle that came anywhere near him. He pulled into a truck stop just off the highway, a rundown place with a handful of pumps and a convenience store that looked like it had been there since the 70s. The lot was nearly empty. Just 2 other big rigs parked at the far end, drivers presumably asleep in their cabs. Boaz maneuvered his truck alongside the diesel pumps and shut off the engine, sitting in the sudden silence for a moment before climbing down. The night air hit him, still warm but less oppressive than it had been in Laredo. He stretched, feeling his spine crack, and walked around to check the trailer. The seals were still intact, undisturbed. The refrigeration unit purred quietly, displaying a steady 38 degrees on its external readout. Everything appeared normal. He filled the tank, watching the numbers climb on the pump's display, and scanned the lot continuously. The dark pickup that had followed him off the highway was nowhere to be seen. Maybe he was just being paranoid. Inside the convenience store, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, harsh and unforgiving. A clerk sat behind bulletproof glass watching a small television with the volume turned low. Boaz grabbed a bottle of water and a package of beef jerky, setting them on the counter and sliding a 20 through the slot. The clerk counted out change without making eye contact, clearly uninterested in conversation. Boaz was fine with that. He took his purchases and headed back outside. That's when he saw the man standing near his truck. The figure was positioned between 2 overhead lights, partially in shadow, watching Boaz's rig with an intensity that made every alarm in Boaz's head start screaming. The man was wearing jeans, a dark jacket despite the heat, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He wasn't doing anything overtly threatening, just standing there, hands in his pockets, but the deliberate stillness of his posture radiated menace. Boaz slowed his pace, adjusting his trajectory to pass closer to the convenience store entrance, keeping the man in his peripheral vision. As he moved, the man turned slightly, and Boaz caught a glimpse of his face beneath the cap's brim. Features weathered and hard, eyes that tracked Boaz's movement with predatory focus. Neither of them spoke. The moment stretched out, taut and dangerous, before the man finally turned and walked away, disappearing around the side of the building. Boaz didn't hesitate. He strode quickly to his truck, climbed into the cab and locked the doors. His heart hammered against his ribs, adrenaline flooding his system. He started the engine and pulled out of the lot faster than was probably safe, tires crunching over loose gravel before hitting asphalt. In his mirrors, he saw no one following, but that didn't slow his pulse. The rest of the drive to McAllen passed in a blur of hypervigilance. Every pair of headlights that appeared behind him sent his anxiety spiking. Every exit ramp looked like a potential ambush point. He white-knuckled the steering wheel, jaw clenched, forcing himself to maintain a steady speed and not draw attention by driving erratically. The miles crawled past with agonizing slowness. When the lights of McAllen finally appeared on the horizon, He felt a wave of relief so intense it was almost physical. The warehouse district sat on the eastern edge of town, a sprawling complex of corrugated metal buildings and loading docks. Boaz navigated the familiar streets, following GPS directions to the specific facility listed on his manifest. It was almost 3 a.m, but the warehouse was lit up. Forklifts moving inside, workers in safety vests directing traffic. He backed his trailer into the assigned dock, killed the engine, and sat for a moment, letting his hands stop shaking. A warehouse worker approached his cab, clipboard in hand, wearing a reflective vest and a bored expression. Boaz rolled down the window and handed over the paperwork, watching as the man scanned the documents with practiced efficiency. "You're early," the worker said, glancing at his watch. "Weren't expecting you until 4. "Made good time," Boaz replied, keeping his voice neutral. The worker nodded absently, already moving toward the trailer doors to check the seals. Boaz watched him in the side mirror, noting the routine way he inspected the locks, comparing numbers to the manifest. After a moment, the worker returned to the cab window. "Seals match. We'll get you unloaded. Should take about 45 minutes. You can wait in the driver's lounge if you want. Coffee's fresh." Boaz thanked him and climbed down from the cab, stretching muscles that had been tensed for hours. He walked into the warehouse facility, following signs to the driver's area, a small room with vending machines, a coffee pot, and a television mounted on the wall. 2 other drivers sat in plastic chairs, barely looking up as he entered. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the liquid dark and strong, and found a seat where he could see through the windows to his truck. The unloading process began, forklifts moving in and out of his trailer, workers calling to each other in Spanish and English. Boaz sipped his coffee and tried to relax, but his mind kept replaying the night's events. The Border Patrol agent's lingering stare, the white SUV pacing him for miles, the man watching his truck at the Rio Grande City stop. All of it could have innocent explanations, but taken together, it formed a pattern he didn't like. 40 minutes later, a worker appeared in the doorway and waved to get his attention. "All done? You're empty." Boaz followed him back to the loading dock, where his trailer sat with its rear doors still open. He walked to the back and peered inside, playing his flashlight beam across the interior. It was completely empty, just bare aluminum walls and floor, no trace of the produce that had filled it hours earlier. The workers had already moved the pallets to cold storage somewhere inside the facility. "Need you to sign here," the worker said, offering the clipboard. Boaz scrawled his signature on the delivery confirmation, took his copy, and thanked the man. The worker disappeared back into the warehouse without another word, leaving Boaz alone with his empty trailer. He was about to close the rear doors when something caught his eye. On the floor of the trailer, near the front wall, was a small, dark stain. Boaz knelt down, touching it with his finger. It was still slightly damp, viscous. He brought his finger to his nose and immediately recoiled. It wasn't produce juice or vegetable matter. It smelled organic but wrong, like meat left too long in questionable conditions. His stomach turned. He wiped his finger on his jeans and straightened, staring at the stain. It was small, easily overlooked, probably meaning nothing, but combined with everything else tonight it felt significant. He grabbed his flashlight and swept the beam methodically across the entire trailer interior, looking for anything else unusual. The walls were clean, the floor mostly spotless except for that single mark. No other evidence of whatever had caused the stain. Boaz secured the trailer doors and walked back to his cab, pulling out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts, hesitating over the number for his dispatcher. He should report this, document the anomaly, cover himself if anything came back on him later. But something stopped him. The dispatcher's odd behavior when handing over this run, the vagueness about the shipper. calling attention to a problem might create more trouble than it solved. He sat in the cab, engine idling, trying to decide. Through the windshield, he could see the warehouse workers going about their business, loading other trucks, moving pallets, completely unconcerned with his presence. Everything looked normal. Maybe he was overthinking this. Maybe the stain was nothing. Spilled vegetable juice that had gone off, and he was letting paranoia get the better of him. Before he could make a decision, his phone buzzed with an incoming text. Unknown number. He opened it, heart rate accelerating before he even read the words. Good work tonight. Second run next Thursday, same route. Details to follow. Don't discuss with dispatch. Boaz stared at the screen, blood draining from his face. He hadn't given anyone his number except official contacts. Whoever sent this knew who he was, knew his route, knew he'd completed the delivery. He typed a quick reply. Who is this? The response came immediately. Someone who pays better than your current rate. Keep your phone on. Then, nothing. Boaz waited, watching the screen, but no further messages appeared. He looked around the parking lot, scanning for anyone watching him, any vehicle that didn't belong. Everything seemed normal, industrial, impersonal, but he felt exposed, vulnerable, like crosshairs were painted on his back. He put the truck in gear and pulled away from the warehouse, hands trembling slightly on the wheel. The empty trailer felt lighter, but the weight of this situation pressed down on him with crushing force. Someone had just recruited him, voluntold him, into something he hadn't agreed to, and walking away might not be an option. The drive back to Laredo should have been easier without the cargo, but Boaz felt more tense than ever. He kept his phone on the passenger seat, screen face up, waiting for another message that didn't come. Dawn was breaking as he crossed back through the Border Patrol checkpoint, the same installation he'd passed heading south. A different agent waved him through after a perfunctory glance at his paperwork, apparently unconcerned with an empty trailer heading north. Boaz made it back to the Laredo depot just before 7 in the morning, exhausted and wired on too much coffee. He parked his rig in the company lot and sat for a moment, staring at the dispatcher's office across the yard. He needed to decide what to do. Report the strange text and risk angering whoever sent it. Take the second run and see where this led, potentially deeper into trouble. Or refuse, quit, walk away from a career he'd built over 15 years. Before he could move, someone tapped on his window. Boaz jerked, hand instinctively reaching for the Glock before he recognized the face outside. It was Foster Llewellyn, a Border Patrol agent he'd encountered a few times over the years at various checkpoints. Llewellyn was in his early 40s, with graying hair and the weathered look of someone who'd spent too many years under the South Texas sun. He wasn't in uniform, just jeans and a polo shirt, which immediately set off alarm bells. Boaz rolled down the window. "Agent Llewellyn, what brings you here?" Llewellyn smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just Foster today. I'm off duty. Mind if we talk? Won't take long." Everything in Boaz's gut screamed that this was a bad idea, but refusing would raise more suspicion. He unlocked the passenger door, and Llewellyn climbed in, settling into the seat with the casual ease of someone who'd spent plenty of time in truck cabs. "Hell of a night?" Llewellyn asked, glancing at Boaz's face. "You look like you've been through it." "Just a long run. What's this about, Foster?" Llewellyn was quiet for a moment, looking out the windshield at the depot yard. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "I was working the checkpoint last night when you came through. Noticed you were hauling for a shipper I haven't seen before." "New client?" Boaz's throat tightened. "That's what dispatch told me. Why?" "Because I've seen that shipper's name on manifests 3 times in the last 2 weeks. Always produce, always refrigerated, always through my checkpoint at odd hours. And all 3 times the drivers looked about as comfortable as you did last night. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, just making conversation. Llewellyn turned to face him directly. But if something doesn't feel right about a run, Boaz, you should trust that instinct. The border's complicated these days. Lots of people trying to move things that shouldn't move. Boaz met his gaze, trying to read what was beneath the words. Are you telling me I hauled something illegal? I'm telling you that if you did, it wasn't your fault, not if you didn't know. But if you take another run like that, knowing what you know now... Llewellyn shook his head slowly. That's when it becomes a choice. I got a text after the delivery, someone offering me another run. Llewellyn's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Did you respond? Asked who it was. They didn't answer directly. Good. Don't respond again. Don't take the run. And if they pressure you, call me. Llewellyn pulled a business card from his wallet, setting it on the dashboard. Personal cell is on the back. Boaz picked up the card, turning it over in his fingers. Why are you helping me? Because I've been doing this job long enough to know the difference between criminals and decent people who get caught in bad situations. You're the latter, but that protection only lasts if you make the right choice from here. Llewellyn opened the passenger door, stepping down from the cab. He paused, one hand on the doorframe. One more thing, if anyone else approaches you about this, someone who isn't law enforcement, be very careful. These operations don't like loose ends. With that, Llewellyn closed the door and walked away, leaving Boaz alone with his thoughts and a business card that felt like both a lifeline and a ticking bomb. Boaz didn't go home after Foster Llewellyn walked away. Instead, he sat in his truck for another 20 minutes, staring at the business card on the dashboard while the morning sun climbed higher and heated the cab to an uncomfortable degree. The depot yard came alive around him, mechanics arriving for their shifts, other drivers pulling in and out. The familiar choreography of a working freight operation. Everything looked normal, routine, the same dance he'd been part of for 15 years. But nothing felt normal anymore. He finally climbed out and headed toward the dispatch office, a squat cinder-block building with narrow windows and an air conditioning unit that rattled loud enough to hear from across the parking lot. Inside, the office smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner. 3 desks sat in a cramped space, 2 of them empty at this hour. Behind the third sat Marcus, the dispatcher who'd given him last night's run, hunched over a computer screen with reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. Marcus looked up as Boaz entered, and for just a fraction of a second, something passed across his face. Recognition, maybe, or concern. Then the professional mask slid back into place and he nodded. Kincannon. How'd the McAllen run go? Fine. Delivered on time. No issues. Boaz kept his voice level, watching Marcus's reaction carefully. Wanted to ask you about the shipper, though. Paperwork said new client. You got any background on them? Marcus's fingers stopped typing. He took off his glasses slowly, setting them on the desk with deliberate care. Why are you asking? Just curious. 15 years on these routes, I know most of the regular shippers. This one's new to me. New to all of us, Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. The vinyl creaked under his weight. They contacted the main office directly, wanted to establish regular service, paid up front, cash deposit. Owner was happy to have the business. What kind of operation are they running? Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. Agricultural distributor out of Nuevo Laredo. Import produce through the bridge, we haul it north. A standard arrangement. Why the interrogation, Boaz? Not interrogating, just Felt a little off last night. Had a vehicle tailing me for a while, then some guy watching my truck at a fuel stop. Made me jumpy. Welcome to the border, Marcus said, but there was no humor in his tone. Lots of people watching everything down here doesn't mean it's connected to your cargo. He paused, studying Boaz's face. Unless you saw something that made you think otherwise. The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implication. Boaz could feel the trap in it, the way Marcus was probing to see how much he knew or suspected. He thought about the stain in the trailer, the cryptic text message, Foster Llewellyn's warning. All of it stayed locked behind his teeth. No, he lied. Nothing specific. Just the usual border paranoia, I guess. Marcus held his gaze for another long moment before nodding and sliding his glasses back on. Good, because this shipper wants to use you again, next Thursday, same route, same time. I was about to call and confirm you were available. There it was. The second run, just like the text message had promised. Except now it was coming through official channels. Boaz's stomach tightened, bile rising in his throat. He needed to refuse, needed to walk away clean like Foster had advised, but something in Marcus's expression told him that refusing wouldn't be simple. There were currents moving beneath this conversation, dangerous undertows that could pull him down if he made the wrong move. I'll have to check my schedule, Boaz said carefully. Got some personal stuff coming up, might need to take a few days. Marcus's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The client specifically requested you. Said you did good work, professional handling. They're willing to pay a premium for the same driver. He pulled a manila envelope from his desk drawer and slid it across the desk. $2,000 cash on top of your regular rate. Just for showing up. Boaz stared at the envelope without touching it. $2,000 was more than triple his usual cut for a run like this. It was the kind of money that bought silence and complicity, the kind of money that turned transport into something else entirely. That's generous, he said quietly. They're a generous client, and they value discretion. Marcus leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. Look, Boaz, I don't know what you think you saw or heard last night, but I'm telling you straight up, this is legitimate business. The produce was real, the paperwork was clean, Border Patrol didn't flag anything. You did your job, you got paid, everyone's happy. Take the second run, pocket the bonus, and stop looking for problems where there aren't any. And if I decide to pass? Marcus was quiet for several seconds, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he didn't want to say. When he spoke, his voice was softer, almost sympathetic. Then you'll be passing on more than just this run. Owner's been talking about downsizing the fleet. Economy's tight, fuel costs are up. Drivers who don't want to work get replaced by drivers who do. You understand what I'm saying? The threat wasn't even veiled. Take the run or lose your job, maybe more than that depending on how deep this went. Boaz felt the walls closing in, options narrowing to a tunnel with darkness at both ends. He could call Foster, hand this over to Border Patrol, probably end up in witness protection if the operation was as serious as it seemed. Or he could play along, gather more information, try to navigate through this without burning his entire life to the ground. I'll take the run, he heard himself say. The words tasted like ash. Marcus smiled, but it was the smile of a man closing a deal, not offering friendship. Smart choice. I'll send you the details by Wednesday. And Boaz? He tapped the manila envelope. Take the advance. Consider it a sign of good faith. Boaz picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of the cash inside, and walked out without another word. The morning sun hit him like a physical force as he stepped into the parking lot, heat already radiating off the asphalt in shimmering waves. He made it to his truck before his hands started shaking, adrenaline and fear catching up with him all at once. He sat in the cab with the envelope on the passenger seat, staring at it like it was a live snake. Taking the money made him part of this, whatever this was, but he'd already agreed to the run, already crossed that line. The money was just confirmation of what he'd already become. He opened the envelope and counted it quickly. 20 crisp hundreds, still smelling like fresh ink. Enough to pay off his credit cards, cover the truck repairs he'd been postponing, maybe even send some to his sister for her kids. Blood money, maybe, but money that could solve immediate problems while he figured out what to do about the larger ones. His phone buzzed. Another text from the unknown number. Confirmed for Thursday. You made the right choice. Boaz deleted the message immediately, though he knew that didn't matter. Whoever was watching him had sources inside the dispatch office, probably inside the company itself. They knew he'd taken the money before he'd even left the parking lot. He started the engine and pulled out, heading toward his apartment on the north side of Laredo, mind racing through scenarios and contingencies. The apartment was a one-bedroom unit in a complex that had seen better decades, with walls thin enough to hear neighbors arguing and plumbing that groaned every time someone flushed a toilet. But it was cheap, close to the depot, and after years on the road, Boaz didn't need much. He unlocked the door and stepped into air that was hot and stale, windows closed and curtains drawn the way he'd left them 2 days ago before starting his last run. He dropped the envelope on the kitchen counter and grabbed a beer from the refrigerator, draining half of it in one long pull. The cold liquid cut through the exhaustion and fear, centering him enough to think clearly. He needed information, needed to understand what he was actually hauling before Thursday's run. The manifest had said produce, and he'd seen pallets of vegetables when the warehouse crew unloaded. But that stain in the trailer suggested something else had been in there, something organic and wrong. Boaz pulled out his laptop and opened a browser searching for the shipper's name from the manifest. The company was listed as Valle Verde Agricultural Distributors, with an address in Nuevo Laredo and a sparse website showing stock photos of produce and generic text about farm-to-table distribution. No names, no faces, no real information. The domain registration was hidden behind a privacy service. The business license checked out through Mexican records, but that didn't mean much. Plenty of legitimate-looking fronts existed on both sides of the border. He tried searching for news about agricultural busts or border patrol seizures in the Laredo sector over the past month, scrolling through local news sites and law enforcement bulletins. Nothing jumped out, just the usual flow of drug interdictions and human smuggling arrests that were constant background noise along the border. Whatever operation Valle Verde was running, it hadn't made headlines yet. That could mean it was small, careful, or too well protected to draw attention. His phone rang, startling him badly enough that he nearly dropped the beer. Unknown number, different from the texts. He considered not answering, then realized avoiding contact was pointless now. He swiped to accept. "This is Boaz." "Mr. Kincannon, my name is Lucretia Vane. I represent the client you drove for last night." The voice was female, smooth and professional, with an accent he couldn't quite place. Educated, expensive. "I wanted to personally thank you for the excellent service and confirm arrangements for Thursday." "Who are you?" Boaz asked, keeping his voice steady despite the fresh spike of adrenaline. "I'm what you might call a facilitator. I ensure smooth operations for various business interests along the border. Your dispatcher mentioned you had some concerns about last night's run. I wanted to address those directly and assure you that everything was entirely legitimate." "Then why are you calling me instead of letting dispatch handle it?" Lucretia Vane laughed softly. "Because I prefer direct communication with the people I work with." It eliminates confusion and builds trust. You strike me as someone who values straight talk, so here it is. My clients move time-sensitive agricultural products across the border. The timing is crucial, the routes are specific, and discretion is essential because competitors would love to disrupt our supply chain. What you hauled last night was exactly what the manifest said. Produce. Nothing more, nothing less. Then why did someone follow me? Security, she said without hesitation. We protect our investments. The vehicle you noticed was contracted security making sure the shipment reached its destination safely. If they made you uncomfortable, I apologize. That wasn't the intention. It was a smooth explanation, delivered with perfect confidence. If Boaz hadn't seen the stain, hadn't received the cryptic texts, hadn't talked to Foster, he might have even believed it. But he had, and the pieces didn't fit the picture she was painting. "What about the bonus?" he asked. $2,000 cash for a routine produce run seems excessive. It's an investment in reliability. Good drivers are hard to find, Mr. Kincannon. Drivers who show up on time, handle cargo properly, and don't ask uncomfortable questions are even rarer. We're willing to pay premium rates to secure that kind of service on a regular basis. She paused, and when she continued, her tone had shifted slightly. Still professional, but with an edge underneath. Of course, we also compensate people who prove they can't be relied upon, though that compensation is considerably less pleasant. There it was, the velvet glove stripped away to show the iron fist beneath. Boaz felt his jaw clench, anger mixing with fear in a toxic cocktail that made his pulse hammer in his temples. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm clarifying expectations," Lucretia said calmly. "You've been brought into a very efficient operation, Mr. Kincannon. Efficiency requires everyone to understand their role and perform it without complications. Your role is simple. Drive the routes you're given, deliver the cargo intact, and maintain complete discretion. Do that, and you'll be compensated generously. Deviate from that, and there will be consequences. Not threats, just facts. And if I walk away, then you'd be walking away from your livelihood, your reputation, and possibly your health, depending on how much you choose to say to the wrong people. But I don't think you'll walk away. You've already taken the money, already agreed to Thursday's run. You're a practical man who understands that sometimes we find ourselves in situations that aren't ideal, but are manageable if we're smart about it." Her voice softened again, becoming almost sympathetic. "This doesn't have to be difficult, Boaz. May I call you Boaz? Just do the work, take the money, and life continues normally. Everyone wins. Except I don't know what I'm actually hauling." "You're hauling produce," Lucretia said firmly. "And that's all you need to know. The less you understand about the broader operation, the safer you are. Ignorance is a shield, Boaz. Don't throw it away by digging into matters that don't concern you." The line went dead before he could respond. Boaz sat staring at his phone, mind reeling. Lucretia Vane had just laid out the reality of his situation with perfect clarity. He was trapped, bought and paid for, with the promise of violence hanging over any attempt to escape. She was right about one thing. He'd already crossed the line by taking the money and agreeing to the second run. Walking away now would just make him a liability instead of an asset. He drained the rest of the beer and grabbed another, pacing the small apartment while he tried to think. Foster's card was still in his truck, the contact information that could theoretically extract him from this mess. But using it meant becoming an informant, wearing a wire, probably testifying if anything went to trial. It meant the end of his career as a trucker, relocation if the operation was connected to cartels, and a permanent target on his back if anything went wrong. The alternative was to play along, at least for now. Take Thursday's run, keep his eyes open, gather information. Maybe figure out what was really being transported and whether it was something he could live with hauling. The stain bothered him deeply, but Lucretia was right that the manifest had shown legitimate produce. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe he was reading sinister intent into what was actually just an aggressive but legal business operation. He spent the rest of the day trying to convince himself of that. Cleaning the apartment, running errands, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. But when night fell and he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the fear came back in full force. He thought about the man at the Rio Grande City fuel stop, standing in the shadows watching his truck. Thought about the white SUV pacing him for miles. Thought about Lucretia Vane's calm voice promising consequences. Sleep came in fitful bursts, full of fragmented dreams where he was driving endless dark highways while things moved in his trailer, scratching at the walls, leaving stains that spread across the aluminum like blood. He woke repeatedly, heart pounding, reaching for his phone to check the time. Each time, the hours had barely moved, time crawling toward Thursday with agonizing slowness. Tuesday morning arrived gray and humid, with heavy clouds promising rain that wouldn't come. Boaz forced himself through a normal routine: shower, coffee, checking his truck for maintenance issues. He drove to a mechanic shop he trusted on the east side of town and had them go over the entire rig, changing oil, checking brakes, inspecting the refrigeration unit on the trailer. While they worked, he sat in the waiting area pretending to read a magazine, actually watching the street for any sign of surveillance. No white SUVs appeared, no dark pickups. No one seemed to be paying him any attention at all, which somehow made him more nervous. If Lucretia's organization was as professional as she presented, their watchers wouldn't be obvious. They'd blend into the background, just another face in the lunch crowd at the taco stand across the street. Just another vehicle in traffic. The mechanic gave him a clean bill of health on the truck, and Boaz paid cash, getting a receipt for his records. Normal procedure, normal day. He drove back toward his apartment, taking a deliberately circuitous route, watching his mirrors constantly. Still no tail that he could identify. Either they weren't watching, or they were good enough that he couldn't spot them. Neither option was comforting. Wednesday brought a text from Marcus with the details for Thursday's run. Same pickup location in Laredo, same destination in McAllen, departure time of 10 p.m. The manifest would be waiting at the depot when he arrived. Simple, straightforward, exactly like the first run. Boaz acknowledged the message with a terse "confirmed" and spent the rest of the day in a state of mounting anxiety. He tried calling his sister in Corpus Christi wanting to hear a familiar voice, but got her voicemail and couldn't figure out what message to leave. "Hey, I might be hauling contraband for a criminal organization, just wanted to say I love you." He hung up without speaking and sat on his couch, staring at the wall. Foster Llewellyn's card sat on his coffee table where he'd left it, the personal cell number written in neat block letters on the back. Boaz picked it up several times throughout the day, phone in his other hand, ready to make the call. Each time he stopped before dialing. Once he brought Foster into this, there was no going back. The wheels would start turning, investigations would begin, and Boaz would be locked into a path he wasn't sure he was ready to walk. Thursday arrived like an execution date. Boaz went through the motions of preparation mechanically. Clean clothes, full thermos of coffee, Glock loaded and secured in its usual spot beneath the driver's seat. He tried to eat but couldn't stomach more than a few bites of toast. His hands were steady, which surprised him. Apparently, his body had accepted what his mind was still fighting. He arrived at the depot at 9:30, earlier than necessary, and found the night crew already loading trucks for various runs. The lot was busy with activity, diesel engines rumbling, forklifts beeping as they reversed, drivers calling to each other in English and Spanish. Boaz backed his rig into the assigned loading dock and walked into the dispatch office to collect his paperwork. Marcus was there, as expected, but he wasn't alone. A woman sat in the chair beside his desk, and Boaz knew immediately who she was before anyone said a word. Lucretia Vane looked exactly like her voice sounded. Polished, expensive, dangerous. She was maybe 40, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a tailored business suit that probably cost more than Boaz made in a month. Her eyes tracked him as he entered, dark and assessing, missing nothing. "Mr. Kincannon," she said, standing and offering her hand. "A pleasure to finally meet in person." Boaz shook her hand automatically, feeling the firm grip and the subtle calluses that suggested she was more than just a corporate facilitator. Her smile was professional, revealing nothing. "Miss Vane, didn't expect to see you here." "I like to personally oversee important shipments," she said smoothly. "Tonight's cargo is time-sensitive, so I wanted to ensure everything proceeds smoothly." She gestured to the folder on Marcus's desk. "Your manifest and paperwork. Everything is in order, seals will match exactly as before. The route is identical to your previous run, but I've arranged for you to have an escort this time." "An escort?" Boaz felt his stomach drop. "Just a precaution. One of our security vehicles will follow at a distance to ensure you reach McAllen without any complications. Think of it as insurance for both of us." She smiled again, and this time there was something sharp behind it. "I'm sure you understand that we need to protect our investment." What she meant was clear. They were watching to make sure he didn't deviate from the route, didn't make any unexpected stops, didn't call anyone he shouldn't. The escort wasn't protection. It was a guard detail making sure their assets stayed in line. "Understood," Boaz said, keeping his voice neutral. "Excellent." Lucretia picked up her purse, expensive leather that matched her shoes. "Then I'll let you get to work. Drive safely, Boaz. I'll see you when you return tomorrow morning to discuss future arrangements." She walked out without waiting for a response, heels clicking on the concrete floor with sharp precision. Marcus handed Boaz the manifest folder without meeting his eyes, and Boaz took it and left, feeling like a man walking to the gallows. The trailer was already loaded and sealed when he returned to the loading dock. The refrigeration unit hummed steadily, display showing 38 degrees. Everything looked identical to the first run. Same type of seals, same paperwork, same shipping company listed. Boaz did his pre-trip inspection on autopilot, checking tire pressure, testing lights, verifying the cargo doors were secure. As he finished the walk-around, a dark blue sedan pulled into the lot and parked near the exit. Tinted windows, no visible markings, 2 silhouettes in the front seats. His escort, presumably. They made no attempt to hide their presence, which was the point. They wanted him to know he was being watched. Boaz climbed into his cab, secured the manifest in its holder, and started the engine. The familiar rumble usually brought comfort, but tonight it just felt like the countdown to something inevitable and bad. He pulled out of the depot at exactly 10 p.m., the dark sedan falling in behind him as he merged onto the access road. The drive south toward McAllen began exactly like the previous run. Empty highway, scattered traffic. The dark sedan maintaining a constant distance of about a quarter-mile behind. Boaz kept his speed steady, hands locked on the wheel, mind churning through his limited options. He could try to lose the tail, take an unexpected exit and drive straight to the nearest Border Patrol station. But that would likely end with violence before he ever reached safety. Lucretia's people weren't going to let him just walk away with their cargo. He could complete the run, take the money, and then immediately contact Foster afterward. Turn informant, cooperate fully, hope for the best. That option seemed increasingly likely. the path of least resistance that might actually keep him alive. Or he could do what some dark part of his mind was suggesting. Just keep driving, take run after run, pocket the money, and stop asking questions. Plenty of people made their living in the gray areas along the border. Maybe he could learn to live with it, whatever it actually was. The first Border Patrol checkpoint appeared ahead, the same installation he'd passed on both previous trips. Boaz slowed, rolling down his window and preparing his documents. The agent who approached was the young one from the first night, the one who'd examined his seals with unusual intensity. Tonight, the agent's expression was carefully neutral as he glanced at the paperwork. Valle Verde Agricultural again, the agent noted. Becoming a regular route for you. Seems that way, Boaz replied, trying to sound casual. The agent walked around to inspect the seals, and Boaz watched in his mirror, heart rate climbing. The dark sedan had pulled off to the side of the highway about 100 yards back, waiting. If the agent found anything wrong, if he decided to do a full inspection, things could escalate very quickly. Boaz's hand drifted toward the Glock beneath his seat, not drawing it, just making sure he knew exactly where it was. After what felt like an eternity, the agent returned to the window and handed back the paperwork. "You're clear. Drive safe." Boaz nodded and pulled forward, watching the checkpoint recede in his mirrors. The dark sedan merged back into traffic behind him, maintaining its position. Nothing had changed. The escort was still there, the cargo was still sealed, and he was still committed to this run. The miles rolled past in tense silence. Boaz passed through Zapata, past the reservoir, past all the landmarks that had seemed so familiar just a week ago. Now they felt different, tainted by context and knowledge. Every shadow along the roadside looked like it could hide a threat. Every vehicle that passed seemed suspicious. The paranoia was exhausting, but he couldn't shut it off. Around midnight, his phone buzzed with a text. He glanced at the screen, expecting another message from the unknown number. Instead, it was from Foster Llewellyn. "Saw you pass through checkpoint, still thinking about what we discussed. Offer stands." Boaz stared at the message, nearly drifting into the shoulder before correcting. Foster must have called in a favor, had someone at the checkpoint alert him when Boaz came through. The agent was keeping tabs, leaving the door open for cooperation. And by texting during the run, he was also sending a message. "I know what you're doing, and I'm giving you one more chance to make the right choice." Boaz deleted the text without responding, glancing at his mirrors. The dark sedan showed no sign of reacting, its headlights steady and unchanging. They couldn't see his phone from that distance, probably didn't know about the message. But Lucretia would have people who could check phone records could see that Foster had made contact. Another complication in an already impossibly tangled situation. Rio Grande City approached, and Boaz felt his anxiety spike. This was where the man had been watching his truck during the first run, standing in the shadows near the fuel pumps. He had no intention of stopping tonight, but as he passed the truck stop, he couldn't help glancing over. The lot was mostly empty at this hour, just a couple of rigs parked and dark. No one stood watching, but somehow that didn't make him feel any better. The final stretch into McAllen passed in a blur of tension and exhaustion. By the time the warehouse district appeared on the horizon, Boaz felt wrung out, muscles aching from hours of rigid alertness. He followed the same route to the same facility, backed into the same loading dock, and watched as the same warehouse workers approached to begin unloading. The dark sedan pulled into the lot but stayed back, parking in a distant corner where it had a clear view of Boaz's truck but wasn't immediately obvious, the watchers settling in to make sure he didn't do anything unexpected while the cargo was transferred. Boaz climbed down from the cab and handed his paperwork to the worker, who processed it with the same efficient disinterest as before. The unloading began, forklifts moving in and out of the trailer, pallets disappearing into the warehouse. Boaz stood outside in the humid night air, watching the process and trying to see what was actually being moved. From his vantage point, the pallets looked like they contained produce, wrapped in plastic and stacked neatly. Nothing obviously wrong, but he remembered the stain from the first run, and his eyes scanned the trailer floor as the workers emptied it. Near the front wall, just barely visible in the harsh work lights, was another small, dark mark. Same location, same size, same suspicious appearance. Whatever was causing those stains was consistent, part of the process, not an accident. When the last pallet was removed and the worker returned with the delivery confirmation for him to sign, Boaz made a decision. Instead of signing immediately, he looked the man in the eye and spoke quietly in Spanish. ¿Qué es realmente en las cajas? What is really in the boxes? The worker's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Fear, recognition, warning. He glanced over Boaz's shoulder toward where the dark sedan sat watching, then looked back and spoke just as quietly. No preguntes cosas que no quieres saber, hermano. Don't ask things you don't want to know, brother. He held out the clipboard more insistently, and Boaz signed the form, watching as the worker walked away quickly, disappearing back into the warehouse without another word. The message was clear. Everyone in this operation knew to keep their mouths shut and their eyes down. Asking questions was dangerous for everyone involved. Boaz closed and secured the trailer doors, checking them twice out of habit, then climbed back into his cab. The dark sedan's engine started as he fired up his own, ready to escort him back to Laredo. As he pulled out of the warehouse lot, his phone buzzed again. Lucretia Vane. Excellent work tonight. Return to depot for payment. We'll discuss the next schedule in the morning. Boaz didn't respond, just pocketed the phone and focused on driving. The return trip passed in exhausted silence, his mind too tired to process everything that had happened. The dark sedan followed him all the way back to Laredo, peeling off only when he pulled into the depot lot. By the time he parked and shut down the engine, dawn was breaking, painting the eastern sky in shades of orange and red that looked like warnings. Marcus was waiting in the dispatch office with another manila envelope, thicker than the first. He pushed it across the desk without comment, and Boaz took it, feeling the weight. More blood money. More complicity. He was in deep now, deeper than he'd ever intended, and the way out was getting harder to see with each run he completed. Miss Vane wants to see you at 9, Marcus said quietly. There's a coffee shop on McPherson, La Esquina. She'll be waiting. Boaz nodded and left, tucking the envelope inside his jacket. He sat in his truck for a long time, watching the depot come alive with the day shift, normal people doing normal work while he sat there knowing he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Foster's card was still in his glove box. Lucretia's next meeting was in 3 hours, and somewhere in his trailer, invisible to inspections and manifests, something was leaving stains that smelled like death. The choice was coming, whether he was ready for it or not. Boaz didn't go home after leaving the depot. Instead, he drove aimlessly through Laredo's empty pre-dawn streets, the manila envelope of cash sitting on the passenger seat like an accusation. The city was just beginning to wake up, streetlights clicking off as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across cracked sidewalks and chain-link fences. He passed taquerias preparing for the breakfast rush, their windows glowing warm against the cool morning air. Past convenience stores where early shift workers stopped for coffee and cigarettes. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that they were sharing the road with someone who'd just become complicit in something he still couldn't fully name. He found himself on San Bernardo Avenue, heading toward the river, then turned north before reaching the International Bridge. The downtown area was quiet at this hour, historic buildings standing silent and dignified in the growing light. Boaz had always liked this part of Laredo, the old architecture that spoke to the city's complicated history, layers of Mexican and American influence blended together in ways that couldn't be separated cleanly. Now it all felt tainted by what he knew, or suspected, about the cargo he was hauling through these streets. At a red light near Jarvis Plaza, he finally opened the envelope and counted the money. $4,000 in hundreds, twice what Lucretia had promised for the run itself. Payment for compliance, for silence, for becoming the kind of driver who didn't ask questions even when he found stains that smelled like decay in his trailer. He tucked the bills back into the envelope and shoved it into the glove compartment, next to Foster Llewellyn's business card. Two different paths, sitting side by side, waiting for him to choose. The meeting with Lucretia was in 3 hours, but Boaz knew he wouldn't sleep even if he tried. Exhaustion pulled at his bones, made his eyes burn and his thoughts slow, but adrenaline and fear kept him wired, nerves singing with tension that wouldn't release. He stopped at a gas station and bought a large coffee, drinking it too fast and burning his tongue, then bought another and forced himself to sip it slowly while he sat in the parking lot and watched traffic build on the highway. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister. "Haven't heard from you in a while. Everything okay?" Boaz stared at the message for a long time, thumb hovering over the keyboard. What could he possibly say? That he was fine, everything was normal, just hauling freight like always? That would be a lie, and his sister had always been good at detecting his lies even over text. That he'd gotten himself into serious trouble and didn't know how to get out? That would just worry her, drag her into something she couldn't help with and didn't deserve to know about. He finally typed, "All good. Been busy with work. We'll call you this weekend. Love you." Another lie, adding to the pile that was growing taller with each hour. He sent it before he could reconsider and watched the message change to delivered, then read. 3 dots appeared, his sister typing a response, then disappeared. Appeared again. Finally, a simple reply, "Okay, be safe out there." If she only knew how far he was from safe. Boaz drove to his apartment and forced himself to shower and change clothes, going through the motions mechanically while his mind churned. The hot water helped marginally, washing away the sweat and diesel smell, but doing nothing for the anxiety coiled in his gut. He dressed in clean jeans and a button-down shirt, something between casual and professional, appropriate for a meeting he definitely didn't want to have. At 8:30, he headed toward McPherson Street, driving slowly through morning traffic and watching his mirrors compulsively. No dark sedans followed him, at least none that he could identify. La Esquina turned out to be a small coffee shop, tucked between a panaderia and a cell phone store, with outdoor seating under a faded awning and hand-painted signs advertising Café de Oa and Pan Dulce. The kind of place that had probably been there for decades, serving the neighborhood long before Starbucks ever considered expanding into South Texas. Boaz parked down the street and walked back, scanning the area for anything out of place. A few customers sat at the outdoor tables, older men reading newspapers and sipping coffee, a young mother with 2 small children sharing a pastry. Normal morning scene. Nothing threatening. But Lucretia's presence would change that calculation instantly. She was already inside when he entered, sitting at a corner table with a clear view of both the entrance and the street beyond. She'd changed from the business suit she'd worn at the depot, now dressed more casually in dark slacks and a cream-colored blouse, hair down around her shoulders. She looked softer, more approachable, which somehow made her more dangerous. The smile she gave him as he approached was warm, almost friendly. "Boaz, thank you for coming. Please, sit. She gestured to the chair across from her. Can I get you something? The coffee here is excellent, and the conchas are the best in Laredo. Coffee's fine, Boaz said, settling into the chair cautiously. His back was to the room, which made him uncomfortable, but repositioning would seem paranoid. He was already at a disadvantage. Lucretia signaled to the woman behind the counter, who brought over a steaming cup of coffee without being asked. Clearly, Lucretia was a regular here, known and comfortable. That detail bothered Boaz more than it probably should have. It suggested permanence, roots in the community, the kind of established presence that made her operation harder to disrupt. You look tired, Lucretia observed, studying his face with those dark, assessing eyes. The run's taking a toll? I'm fine. What did you want to discuss? She laughed softly, stirring sugar into her own coffee with a small spoon. Direct, I appreciate that. Let's talk about your future, Boaz. You've completed 2 runs successfully, proven you can handle the work and maintain discretion. That makes you valuable, and I like to invest in valuable assets. I'm not an asset, I'm a driver. You're both, she corrected gently. And the sooner you accept that, the easier this arrangement will become. I'm offering you a permanent position in our distribution network. 4 runs per week, same routes, same procedures. $12,000 per week, paid in cash, completely separate from your official payroll. That's over $600,000 per year, Boaz, tax-free. The number hit him like a physical blow. $600,000 was more money than he'd made in the last 5 years combined, more than he'd ever imagined earning as a truck driver. It was life-changing money, the kind of money that could pay off every debt, buy a house, set up his sister's kids for college. It was also the kind of money that bought absolute loyalty and silence, that turned a man into something he'd never intended to become. What exactly am I hauling? He asked quietly. Lucretia sipped her coffee, taking her time before answering. When she spoke, her voice was measured, careful. You're hauling agricultural products exactly as the manifests state. But those products are packaged in ways that maximize efficiency and minimize waste. Some of our clients have specific requirements for how their goods are transported and stored. We accommodate those requirements. It was the same non-answer she'd given before, dressed up in different words. Boaz felt frustration rising, mixing with the fear. The stains in my trailer, what causes them? Condensation from the refrigeration system, combined with organic material breaking down during transport. Produce spoils, Boaz. Even with proper temperature control, some degradation occurs. That's why timing is so crucial. She leaned forward slightly, expression serious. But I think you're asking the wrong questions. What you should be asking is whether you can live with not knowing every detail, whether the compensation is worth accepting certain ambiguities. And if I can't live with that? Lucretia's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. Then you'd be making a decision that would disappoint a lot of people who've invested considerable time and resources into establishing your reliability. Disappointed people make poor decisions, Boaz. They act rashly, eliminate problems instead of managing them. I'd hate to see you become a problem that needs eliminating. There it was again, the threat delivered with perfect calm, wrapped in professional courtesy. Boaz felt his jaw clench, muscles tightening across his shoulders. You can't just threaten to kill everyone who won't cooperate with you. I'm not threatening to kill you, Lucretia said, sounding almost offended. I'm explaining consequences. There's a difference. If you walk away from this arrangement quietly, take your money and keep your mouth shut, you'll live a long and prosperous life. We'll find another driver, you'll find other work, everyone moves on. But if you make noise, if you bring law enforcement or media attention, if you become a liability instead of an asset, then yes, there will be consequences. Not because we're violent people, but because we're practical ones who protect our interests. She pulled a small leather notebook from her purse and slid it across the table. Boaz opened it reluctantly and found himself looking at photographs. His apartment building, his sister's house in Corpus Christi, his niece and nephew playing in their front yard. Each image was date-stamped from within the last week. His blood ran cold. "You followed my family?" "We did our due diligence," Lucretia said calmly. "Standard procedure for anyone we bring into the organization. We need to understand who you are, what matters to you, what motivates you. Your sister Teresa is a teacher, 2 children, divorced 3 years ago. She struggles financially but refuses to ask for help. You send her money when you can, usually around the holidays. You're a good brother, Boaz. That's admirable." Boaz closed the notebook with shaking hands, fury and terror warring in his chest. "Leave them out of this. They're already out of it. As long as you make smart choices. We have no interest in hurting innocent people. But we need assurances that you understand the full scope of this arrangement. It's not just about you anymore. Your decisions affect everyone connected to you." She took the notebook back and returned it to her purse. "I don't enjoy these tactics, for what it's worth. I prefer positive motivation, generous compensation, mutual benefit. But I've learned that clarity prevents misunderstandings, and misunderstandings get people killed." Boaz forced himself to breathe slowly, trying to calm the panic threatening to overwhelm him. Lucretia had just shown him exactly how trapped he was, how thoroughly they'd researched him, how far their reach extended. Fighting back wasn't just risking himself anymore, it was risking Teresa and her kids, innocent people who had nothing to do with his poor decisions. "What do you want from me?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Continued cooperation. 4 runs per week, starting next Monday. We'll vary the routes slightly to avoid establishing predictable patterns, but the procedures remain the same. Pick up sealed cargo, deliver to specified locations, maintain complete discretion. In return, you receive weekly payment and the peace of mind that comes from knowing your family is safe and your future is secure." She paused, letting that sink in. "This doesn't have to be unpleasant, Boaz. Many of our drivers have worked with us for years. They've bought homes, started businesses, built comfortable lives. The work becomes routine, the moral questions fade, and the money keeps coming. You can have that too, if you're smart enough to accept it." "And if I'm not?" Lucretia sighed, something almost like genuine regret crossing her face. "Then, we'll be forced to make other arrangements and you'll be replaced by someone with fewer scruples and more desperate circumstances. The operation continues regardless. The only variable is whether you're part of it or part of the cleanup." She stood, leaving a $20 bill on the table to cover both coffees. "You have until Monday to decide. If you show up at the depot for the next run, I'll take that as acceptance of the terms we've discussed. If you don't show up, I'll take that as resignation from both this arrangement and your official employment. Either way, life goes on. Choose wisely, Boaz." She walked out without looking back, leaving him sitting alone with cold coffee and a decision that felt like choosing between different methods of slow death. Boaz sat there for another 10 minutes, staring at nothing, while the cafe bustled around him. The young mother gathered her children and left. The old men folded their newspapers and headed out for their daily routines. Life continuing normally while his world collapsed into impossible choices. He finally stood and walked out into the bright morning sun, squinting against the glare. His truck sat down the street, the vehicle that had been his livelihood and freedom for 15 years, now transformed into a prison cell with wheels. He climbed in and sat behind the wheel, hands gripping it tightly enough to make his knuckles ache. Foster's card was still in the glove compartment. Boaz pulled it out and stared at the phone number written on the back. One call could potentially end this, bring in federal law enforcement, start an investigation that might protect him and his family. Or it might just get them killed faster if Lucretia's organization had sources inside Border Patrol, if they knew about the call before Foster could act on it. The border was riddled with corruption, money buying loyalty at every level. Trusting that one agent could protect him seemed naive at best, suicidal at worst. He started the engine and drove, not toward home but out of the city, heading north on I-35 without any particular destination in mind. He just needed to move, needed to feel like he had some control even if it was just control over which direction he pointed his truck. The highway opened up, traffic thinning as he left Laredo behind, and for a few miles he could almost pretend everything was normal. Just another drive, just another empty road stretching toward the horizon. His phone rang, snapping him out of the temporary escape. Unknown number, different from Lucretia's. He almost didn't answer, then realized that avoiding contact was pointless now. He accepted the call. Boaz Kincannon? Male voice, professional, unfamiliar. Who's asking? My name's irrelevant. What's relevant is that I represent interests aligned with Miss Vane's organization. She asked me to follow up on this morning's conversation, make sure you understood the full scope of your options. I understood just fine, Boaz said, anger creeping into his voice. You people made your point very clear. I'm not calling to threaten you, the voice continued calmly. I'm calling to offer perspective. You're thinking about this situation as a trap, something you need to escape from. That's understandable but incorrect. What you're actually looking at is an opportunity that most people would kill for. Literally, in some cases. $600,000 per year for work you're already qualified to do, work that poses minimal risk if you follow instructions. Do you understand how rare that is? Do you understand that I don't know what I'm actually hauling? That I could be transporting anything from drugs to weapons to human beings? You're transporting produce, the voice said firmly. That's what the manifests state. That's what inspections have confirmed. That's what reality is. Everything else is speculation and paranoia. The only question is whether you can accept that reality and move forward, or whether you're going to let fear destroy a lucrative opportunity. Boaz laughed bitterly. You sound like a recruiter trying to fill a quota. I'm someone who's seen what happens when drivers make poor decisions. Some of them end up in federal custody, testifying against organizations that have very long memories and even longer reach. Some of them end up in accidents, tragic but explicable vehicle malfunctions on remote stretches of highway. And some of them simply disappear, leaving families to wonder and mourn. I'm trying to help you avoid all of those outcomes by making the smart choice. The smart choice being to shut up and drive. Exactly. You're a natural at this. The voice paused. Look, I know you're scared. That's appropriate. You should be scared because this is serious business with serious consequences. But fear should lead to caution, not paralysis. Be cautious. Follow protocols. Maintain discretion, and you'll be fine. Start making noise or trying to play hero and you won't be. It's that simple. What if I just quit? Take my money and leave town, start over somewhere else. Then you'd be leaving your sister and her children without your financial support, which would be unfortunate given their circumstances. You'd also be leaving with the knowledge that organizations like ours have connections everywhere, that geography doesn't provide safety when we decide someone needs to be found. The smart move is to stay, work, prosper. The dangerous move is to run. The line went dead before Boaz could respond. He threw the phone onto the passenger seat and pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing the truck up to 80 as the highway blurred past. Empty ranch land stretched on both sides, mesquite and cactus, and red dirt baking under the merciless Texas sun. He could keep driving north, toward San Antonio, toward Austin, toward anywhere that wasn't Laredo. But what would that accomplish? Lucretia's people knew where Teresa lived, knew where her kids went to school. Running would just confirm he was a threat that needed to be dealt with. He drove for another hour before turning around, heading back south toward Laredo with a heavy sense of inevitability settling over him. The choice had already been made, really, the moment he'd taken that first envelope of cash. Everything since then had just been pretending he still had options, that he could somehow navigate through this without becoming what they wanted him to become. By the time he reached his apartment, it was early afternoon. The heat had become oppressive, the kind of thick humidity that made breathing feel like work. Boaz climbed the stairs to his second-floor unit, unlocked the door, and stepped into air that was even hotter inside. He turned on the window AC unit, which groaned to life reluctantly, and collapsed onto his couch. Sleep came despite his anxiety, exhaustion finally overwhelming fear. He dreamed of driving endless highways while his trailer leaked black fluid that stained the asphalt behind him, leaving a trail that helicopters followed from above. He dreamed of Teresa's house burning while he was trapped in his truck, unable to open the door or break the windows. He dreamed of Foster Llewellyn standing at a checkpoint with his hand on his weapon, face expressionless, as Boaz drove past hauling cargo that screamed from inside the sealed trailer. He woke gasping, drenched in sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature. The AC had managed to cool the apartment to barely tolerable levels, and dim evening light filtered through the curtains. He'd slept for nearly 5 hours, his body claiming the rest it desperately needed even while his mind churned through nightmares. His phone showed 3 missed calls, all from the depot. Marcus probably trying to confirm he was still on the schedule, that Lucretia's recruitment had been successful. Boaz ignored them and walked to the kitchen, downing 2 glasses of water in quick succession. His reflection in the window above the sink looked haggard, eyes shadowed and face drawn. He barely recognized himself, though whether that was from physical exhaustion or moral erosion, he couldn't say. His laptop sat on the small dining table where he'd left it days ago, screen dark. He opened it and navigated to a news site, searching for any recent stories about Border Patrol busts or federal investigations in the Laredo sector. Nothing stood out, just the usual flow of drug seizures and immigration arrests. He tried searching for Valle Verde agricultural distributors again, digging deeper into business records and trade licenses. The company existed on paper, filed appropriate tax documents, maintained what looked like legitimate operations, but the ownership structure was buried under layers of corporate entities and international partnerships that would take a forensic accountant weeks to unravel. He was about to close the laptop when an email notification popped up. Message from an address he didn't recognize, subject line blank. His gut told him to delete it immediately, that nothing good could come from opening mysterious emails at this point. But curiosity and desperation made him click it. The message contained a single sentence. "You're not the only driver asking questions." Below that was a phone number with a 956 area code, local to the Rio Grande Valley. Nothing else, no signature or context. Boaz stared at it for a long time, weighing the obvious risks of responding against the desperate hope that someone else might be in the same situation, might have information or a way out that he hadn't considered. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number before he could talk himself out of it. It rang 4 times, then a man's voice answered, cautious and quiet. "Who is this?" Someone who got an email saying I'm not the only driver asking questions. Boaz replied carefully. That you? Depends. You working for Valle Verde? Yeah. You? There was a long pause. The sound of breathing and background noise, maybe traffic. Finally, used to. Not anymore. We should talk, but not over the phone. You know the truck stop near Ensenal, off 35? I know it. Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. Come alone, obviously. Park on the east side near the repair base. I'll find you. The line went dead. Boaz sat holding the phone, adrenaline spiking again. This could be a setup. Lucretia's people testing his loyalty by seeing if he'd reach out to other drivers. Or it could be legitimate. Another person caught in the same trap looking for allies or information. Either way, going to the meeting was dangerous. But so was doing nothing, staying paralyzed while the walls closed in around him. He spent the evening pacing his apartment, playing out scenarios in his mind. If it was a setup and he didn't go, that might actually make him look more suspicious, like he was afraid to even talk to other drivers. If he went and it was legitimate, he might learn something useful about the operation, or find someone else willing to cooperate with authorities. If he went and it was a trap, he'd be confirming that he was exactly the liability Lucretia suspected. By midnight, he'd made a decision. He would go, but he would take precautions. He pulled out his phone and composed a text to Foster Llewellyn, drafting it carefully before sending, "Need to meet. Have information about Valle Verde operation. Can you be near Ensenal tomorrow morning at 6 a.m.? Don't approach unless I signal. Just be close in case things go wrong." He stared at the message for 10 minutes before finally sending it. The reply came within seconds. "I'll be there." "What's the signal?" Boaz thought for a moment, then typed, "If I flash my headlights 3 times, move in fast. If I drive away normally, stay back and I'll contact you later." "Understood. Be careful." Boaz set an alarm for 4:30 a.m. and tried to sleep, though his mind wouldn't stop churning. He dozed fitfully, jerking awake repeatedly with his heart pounding, certain he'd heard someone trying his door or footsteps in the hallway outside. Each time, there was nothing, just his own paranoia manifesting as phantom threats. But the paranoia felt justified, earned through contact with people who'd proven they were capable of surveillance and violence. The alarm pulled him from uneasy sleep at 4:30. He showered quickly, dressed in his usual work clothes, and grabbed the Glock from beneath his mattress, checking that it was loaded before tucking it into the back of his waistband. He'd never carried concealed before, had always kept the weapon secured in his truck for emergencies. But this qualified as an emergency, and being armed seemed like the bare minimum of caution given the circumstances. He made coffee in his truck's thermos and headed out into pre-dawn darkness, driving north toward Encino with his mirrors constantly monitored. No headlights followed that he could identify. No vehicles maintained suspicious distances. The highway was nearly empty at this hour, just a few early commuters and long-haul trucks heading toward San Antonio. Normal traffic, normal morning, except for the weight of the weapon against his spine and the fear coiled in his gut. The truck stop at Ensenal appeared just before 6, a sprawling facility with fuel pumps, a restaurant, and a repair facility that serviced commercial vehicles. Boaz pulled in and drove past the main building toward the east side where several semi-trucks sat in various states of repair, some with hoods open and mechanics already working despite the early hour. He parked near the back of the lot where he had a clear view of approaching vehicles, but was partially concealed behind a larger rig. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Boaz scanned the lot continuously, watching for anyone approaching on foot or any vehicles pulling in that might be connected to Valle Verde. His hand drifted to the Glock periodically, reassuring himself it was there, ready if needed. At 6:15, A dusty Ford pickup pulled into the lot and parked 3 spaces away. A man climbed out, late 40s or early 50s, wearing jeans and a faded work shirt. He was Hispanic, weathered face and calloused hands, the look of someone who'd spent decades doing physical labor. He walked toward Boaz's truck slowly, hands visible and empty, stopping a few feet away from the driver's door. Boaz rolled down the window halfway, keeping his right hand near the weapon. "You the one who sent the email?" The man nodded. "Name's irrelevant, but you can call me anything you want. I drove for Valle Verde for 8 months before I figured out what was really going on. And what's really going on. You first. What made you start asking questions?" Boaz hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. "Found stains in my trailer after deliveries. Smell was wrong, not produced spoilage. Got suspicious." The man's expression darkened. "Yeah, the stains. That's what tipped me off too. Took me weeks to figure out what they were, and when I did, I nearly put my truck into a bridge abutment rather than make another run." "What are they?" The man glanced around the lot, checking that no one was close enough to overhear, then stepped closer to Boaz's window. "Bodies, or parts of them. Valle Verde's produce shipments are real, but they're packaged with human remains mixed in. People who cross the border illegally pay coyotes to guide them, then disappear into the distribution network. Some are harvested for organs, some are used as mules for drugs, some are just killed and disposed of when they're no longer useful. The refrigerated produce is perfect cover, hides the smell, explains the temperature requirements, provides legitimate reason for sealed trailers." Boaz felt the bottom drop out of his stomach, nausea rising so fast he had to swallow hard to keep from vomiting. "You're telling me I've been hauling dead bodies?" "Parts, probably. They don't waste space on full corpses. Organs packed in ice inside the produce crates, tissue samples, whatever has value on the black market. The rest gets incinerated at the distribution centers. That's why the manifests are always time-sensitive, why they pay premium rates for fast delivery. Organs have shelf life, even refrigerated." Jesus Christ. Boaz leaned his forehead against the steering wheel, breathing shallowly. "How do you know this?" "You see it yourself." "I started following delivery trucks after they left the warehouses. Saw where they went next. Medical facilities, research labs, places that don't ask too many questions about where specimens come from. And I talked to other drivers who worked the route before me, ones who got out or tried to. Most of them are dead now. Accidents and disappearances that never get investigated too hard because who cares about some trucker who probably just drank too much and drove off a bridge, right? Why are you still alive if you know all this?" The man smiled grimly. "Because I was smart enough to get insurance before I quit. Documentation, photographs, records of shipments cross-referenced with missing persons reports. All of it stored in multiple locations with instructions to release everything if anything happens to me. Lucretia Vane knows I have it. Knows killing me would just make things worse for her organization. So we have an understanding. I stay quiet, I stay breathing. But I can't help people once they're already in the system. That's why I sent you the email. You're still early enough to get out clean if you're smart about it." "How?" "They've threatened my family. They're watching everything I do. They've made it clear that walking away isn't an option. It's always an option. You just have to be willing to pay the price. Mine was relocating my family to another state, changing my name, giving up trucking entirely, and working construction under the table. Yours might be different, but the principle is the same. You can't fight them directly, but you can remove yourself from their reach if you're willing to sacrifice enough." Boaz thought about Teresa and her kids, about uprooting their lives because of his mistakes. What about going to law enforcement? Border Patrol, FBI? Someone who can actually shut this down? The man laughed bitterly. You think they don't have people inside those agencies? Valle Verde's been operating for at least 5 years that I know of, probably longer. You don't survive that long on the border without buying protection at every level. The agents who aren't bought off directly are hamstrung by the ones who are, evidence disappearing, investigations stalling, witnesses dying before they can testify. You go to the authorities, you're just painting a bigger target on yourself. So what am I supposed to do? Just keep hauling body parts until I can't live with myself anymore? You document everything you can without getting caught. You create your own insurance package. And when you have enough leverage, you negotiate your exit. That's the only way out that doesn't end with you in a ditch or your family in danger. The man pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it through the window. These are the locations where I stashed my documentation. If something happens to me before I can use it, maybe you can make sure it sees daylight. Or maybe it just gives you ideas for how to protect yourself. Boaz took the paper, unfolding it to see a list of addresses and storage unit numbers scattered across South Texas and northern Mexico. Why are you helping me? Because I've lost count of how many drivers have been chewed up by this operation. Someone has to survive long enough to make a difference, to gather enough evidence that even Valle Verde's connections can't suppress it. Maybe that's you. Probably not. Statistics aren't in your favor. But I've got to try. The man turned and walked back to his pickup, climbing in without another word. Boaz watched him drive away, turning north on the highway and disappearing into the growing dawn light. He sat alone in his truck, staring at the list of addresses, trying to process everything he'd just learned. Bodies, human trafficking and organ harvesting and murder, all disguised as agricultural distribution. He'd been complicit in that, had delivered cargo containing pieces of people who'd died trying to cross the border seeking better lives. He should have felt horror, revulsion, anger. And he did feel all those things, churning in his gut until he had to open the door and lean out, dry heaving into the parking lot. But underneath the moral disgust was something else. Terror. Because now he knew what was really happening, which made him infinitely more dangerous to Lucretia's organization. Ignorance had been protecting him, giving them reason to keep him alive and useful. Knowledge turned him into a liability that needed managing. His phone buzzed with a text from Foster Llewellyn. I'm parked at the restaurant. Everything okay? No signal yet. Boaz typed back. Stand down. Meeting's over. I'll contact you later. He needed time to think, to decide whether what the other driver had told him was accurate or just paranoid speculation. Bodies seemed extreme, though it would explain the stains, the smell, the premium pay. But it was also the kind of story someone might invent to scare him, to test whether he'd run straight to law enforcement and reveal himself as untrustworthy. He started the engine and pulled out of the truck stop, heading back toward Laredo with his mind spinning through possibilities. By the time he reached the city limits, he'd made a decision. He would make Monday's run as scheduled, but he would be looking for evidence documenting everything he could safely observe. If what the driver said was true, Boaz needed proof before he could make any moves. If it was false, he needed to know that too before he destroyed his life based on bad information. The weekend passed in a fog of anxiety and preparation. Boaz acquired a small HD camera and mounted it inside his cab, positioned to record the loading process and anything visible through his mirrors. He bought a notebook and started logging every detail he could remember about the previous runs: times, locations, vehicle descriptions, names. He avoided all contact with Marcus and ignored 2 calls from Lucretia's number. Sunday night, he barely slept. Monday morning arrived like a verdict being read, final and irreversible. He showered, dressed, loaded his Glock, and drove to the depot with the camera running. Whatever he was about to discover, at least he'd have a record of it. That small act of defiance was all the control he had left. Monday night arrived with the kind of oppressive humidity that made the South Texas air feel like a living thing pressing down on everything it touched. Boaz Kincannon sat in his Peterbilt outside the Laredo depot at 9:45, watching mechanics move through their evening routines under the harsh glare of sodium vapor lights that turned everything beneath them a sickly orange. His hands rested on the steering wheel, not gripping it yet, just touching the worn leather that had molded itself to his palms over 15 years of long hauls. The hidden camera mounted behind his sun visor recorded everything, its tiny lens capturing the loading dock, the workers moving between trailers, the dark sedan already positioned near the depot entrance like a predator waiting for prey to emerge. The weight of the Glock pressed against the small of his back, tucked into his waistband beneath his work shirt. He'd carried it concealed for the first time this morning, breaking every habit he'd developed about weapon safety and legal carry. But legal consideration seemed almost quaint now, given what he was involved in. The gun was a small comfort, probably useless if things went truly wrong, but having it there made him feel slightly less helpless. Slightly. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Bay 7, manifest waiting in office. Ms. Vane says everything's confirmed for tonight. Boaz read the message twice, looking for subtext or hidden meaning in the dispatcher's words. Finding none, he climbed out of the cab and walked across the lot toward the dispatch office, every step feeling heavy with significance. The camera in his truck continued recording, preserving the empty cab, the steering wheel, the dashboard lights glowing softly in the darkness. Evidence being accumulated frame by frame, second by second, building a documentary record of whatever came next. The depot felt different tonight. Maybe it had always been this way and he'd just never noticed. Or maybe knowing what he knew now changed how he perceived everything. The shadows between the trailers seemed darker, more concealing. The workers moved with what looked like deliberate avoidance, not making eye contact, staying focused on their tasks with an intensity that suggested they knew better than to be curious. The security cameras mounted on light poles tracked his movement across the lot, lenses following him like mechanical eyes reporting back to someone, somewhere, who was watching and evaluating. Marcus was alone in the dispatch office when Boaz entered, sitting behind his desk with the exhausted expression of a man who'd given up fighting against the current years ago and now just let it carry him wherever it wanted. He pushed a manila folder across the desk without looking up from his computer screen, where a spreadsheet glowed with columns of numbers that probably represented loads and routes and drivers, all the moving pieces of a freight operation that was both exactly what it appeared to be and something much darker underneath. Same route as before, Marcus said quietly. Same timing, same procedures. Loads already staged at Bay 7, seals are attached, refrigeration unit is running. You know the drill by now. Boaz took the folder and opened it, scanning the manifest. Valle Verde Agricultural Distributors, Mixed Produce. Destination, McAllen Distribution Center. Bill of lading, customs documentation, temperature logs, everything in perfect order. Paper trail designed to withstand any casual inspection, maybe even survive serious scrutiny if the inspectors weren't looking for the right things or asking the right questions. Miss Vane mentioned regular rotation starting tonight, Boaz said, watching Marcus's reaction. 4 runs per week, indefinitely. Marcus finally looked up, and for just a moment something passed across his face. Regret, maybe, or sympathy, or the weary recognition of another driver being pulled into the machinery. Yeah, you're on the schedule. Wednesday, Friday, Sunday, plus tonight. Good steady work, good steady pay. Most drivers would kill for that kind of regular rotation. The word choice seemed deliberate. Kill. Most drivers would kill for this opportunity. Boaz wondered how many had, either literally or figuratively. How many had compromised themselves step by step until they were in so deep that murder became just another business cost, another line item in the moral bankruptcy they'd accumulated. "Any special instructions for tonight?" Boaz asked. "Just the usual. Maintain schedule. Follow the route exactly. No unauthorized stops. Escort vehicles will be with you like before." Marcus hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "Look, Kincannon, I don't know what you think is happening here, and I don't want to know. My advice? Do the work, take the money, don't ask questions that don't have good answers. That's how you survive in this business." "What if I can't do that?" Marcus looked at him for a long moment, something sad and knowing in his eyes. "Then you already know what happens. You've been around long enough to understand how this works. Some doors, once you walk through them, they lock behind you. Only way forward is to keep walking." Boaz wanted to ask how Marcus had ended up here, what compromises had led him to this desk and this job and this quiet acceptance of what Valle Verde was doing. But the question seemed cruel, like asking a man in quicksand to explain how he'd gotten stuck. The answer didn't matter. Only the fact of being stuck mattered, and they were both in it now, sinking at different rates towards the same bottom. He left the office without another word, walking back across the lot to Bay 7 where his trailer waited. The refrigeration unit hummed with its steady mechanical rhythm, the sound that had been the soundtrack to his career for so many years. Normally, it was comforting, that steady purr of machinery doing its job, keeping cargo cold, preserving perishables during the long miles between pickup and delivery. Tonight it sounded ominous, like something alive and malevolent breathing in the darkness. 2 workers in reflective vests were finishing the seal attachment when Boaz approached, checking the numbers against a clipboard and confirming everything matched. Standard procedure, done thousands of times across thousands of loading docks. A ritual of verification that was supposed to ensure cargo integrity and chain of custody. But seals could be replaced, numbers could be falsified, and the whole system could be corrupted if enough people were willing to look the other way or actively participate in the deception. "All set," one of the workers said in Spanish, not meeting Boaz's eyes. "Seals match the manifest, temperature is stable at 38 degrees, unit is running clean, you're good to roll." Boaz thanked him and walked around the trailer, examining it with the kind of attention he'd normally reserve for a pre-trip safety inspection. The aluminum walls showed no obvious damage, no dents or scratches that might indicate tampering. The tires were properly inflated, the mud flaps secure, the lights all functioning. Everything looked normal, professional, exactly like it should. Which meant nothing, because the horror wasn't visible from the outside. It was hidden inside those sealed containers, mixed with the legitimate produce, concealed beneath layers of packaging and refrigeration. He thought about the stains he'd found after previous deliveries, dark marks on the trailer floor that smelled wrong. Organic but rotten in a way that produce shouldn't smell even when it was spoiling. The former driver's words echoed in his mind. Bodies, or parts of them, organs packed in ice, tissue samples, whatever has value on the black market. Human remains being transported like any other commodity, bought and sold and harvested from people who'd crossed the border hoping for better lives, and instead found themselves reduced to spare parts. The nausea that had become his constant companion over the past few days rose again, bile burning the back of his throat. He forced it down, forced himself to breathe slowly through his nose, forced his hands to stay steady as he completed the walk-around inspection. The camera in his cab was recording this too, capturing his approach to the trailer, documenting the seals and the workers and the loading dock. Evidence accumulating frame by frame. Boaz climbed into the cab and started the engine, letting it warm up while he secured the manifest in its holder and adjusted his mirrors. The dark sedan that had been waiting near the depot entrance pulled out and positioned itself on the access road, ready to fall in behind once he exited the lot. They weren't even pretending to be subtle anymore, just openly declaring their surveillance, making sure he understood there was no privacy, no escape, no moment when he wasn't being watched and evaluated. His phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number, though by now he recognized it as one of several that Lucretia Vane rotated through. Safe travels tonight. Looking forward to our conversation next week about your expanded role. Expanded role. The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. She was telling him that this wasn't the end point, that more was coming, that the organization had plans for him beyond just driving routes. Maybe recruitment of other drivers, maybe active participation in the logistics of the operation, maybe something worse that he couldn't yet imagine. Each run pulled him deeper. Each payment bought more of his complicity. Each day of silence made him more culpable in whatever Valle Verde was doing. He didn't respond to the text, just put the phone face down on the passenger seat and pulled out of Bay 7. The depot gate attendant waved him through without a word, and Boaz guided the rig onto the access road, watching as the dark sedan merged seamlessly into position behind him. The escort was in place, the cargo was sealed, the route was predetermined. All he had to do was drive, follow instructions, deliver the load, and collect his payment. Simple, easy. Just don't think about what's in the trailer. Don't imagine the people those remains belong to. Don't calculate the moral weight of each mile traveled in service of this operation. The highway stretched ahead, dark and empty except for scattered commercial traffic. Boaz settled into the rhythm of driving, hands on the wheel, eyes on the road, mind trying desperately not to think about anything except the immediate task. But thoughts intruded anyway, unbidden and unwelcome. Teresa and her kids sleeping peacefully in Corpus Christi, unaware that their uncle had become complicit in human trafficking. Foster Llewellyn, somewhere out there in the darkness, maybe on duty, maybe off, hoping that Boaz would make contact and agree to cooperate fully instead of this half measure of gathering evidence while still making runs. The former driver who'd warned him, who'd created his insurance package and escaped, now probably looking over his shoulder every day, wondering if Valle Verde would decide his continued existence was too much of a risk. 20 miles south of Laredo, Boaz passed the first Border Patrol checkpoint. The installation sat lit up like a small city, banks of floodlights illuminating inspection lanes and secondary search areas. Agent vehicles parked in neat rows, the green and white color scheme of federal authority on display. It was supposed to be reassuring, this visible presence of law enforcement protecting the border, interdicting illegal crossings and contraband smuggling. But Boaz knew now that the checkpoint was just theater, a performance of security that Valle Verde had learned to navigate through some combination of corruption, careful planning, and understanding which agents were bought off and which were just too overwhelmed to look too closely. The agent who approached his window was the same young one from previous runs, the one who'd examined his seals with unusual intensity that first night. Tonight, his expression was different, more resigned, less curious. He glanced at Boaz's documents, walked around to verify the seals, and returned without asking any questions or making any comments beyond the standard "drive safe" dismissal. Either he'd been told to leave Valle Verde shipments alone, or he'd learned through experience that some battles weren't worth fighting, some questions weren't worth asking. Boaz rolled forward, watching the checkpoint recede in his mirrors. The dark sedan followed through without being stopped, confirming what he'd already suspected. Valle Verde's escorts had some kind of arrangement, some understanding that allowed them to pass freely. Maybe badges under false names, Maybe radio frequencies that signaled friendly passage. Maybe just the institutional knowledge that these particular vehicles belonged to an organization that had powerful protections. His phone rang, startling him badly enough that he jerked the wheel slightly before correcting. Unknown number, different from Lucretia's texts. He considered not answering, then realized that avoiding contact was pointless. They knew where he was, what he was doing, every move he made. Pretending otherwise was just denial. "This is Boaz. Mr. Kincannon." Male voice, professional and measured, with the kind of calm that suggested either extensive training or natural sociopathy. "My name is irrelevant to this conversation. What's relevant is that I represent certain interests aligned with Ms. Vane's organization, and I wanted to ensure we had clarity about expectations going forward. I already talked to Lucretia about expectations. I'm making the runs, following procedures, keeping my mouth shut. What more do you want?" Continued cooperation, obviously, but also awareness. "You've been asking questions, Mr. Kincannon, talking to people, making inquiries, demonstrating curiosity about matters that don't concern you. That creates complications." Boaz's blood ran cold. They knew about Ensenal, knew about his meeting with the former driver. Possibly they knew about Foster, too, knew about every contact he'd made and every conversation he'd had. The surveillance wasn't just following him during runs, it was comprehensive, covering every aspect of his life, tracking every move he made. "I haven't talked to anyone," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We both know that's untrue. But I'm not calling to debate facts. I'm calling to clarify consequences. Your family in Corpus Christi, they're very important to you. Your sister Teresa, her children Miguel and Sofia, they represent your entire world outside of this work. That makes them both your greatest strength and your greatest vulnerability." The casual mention of his niece and nephew's names felt like a physical blow. Boaz's hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white, rage and terror warring in his chest. "You leave them alone. They have nothing to do with this. They have everything to do with this, Mr. Kincannon. They're the reason you'll continue cooperating, the reason you'll stop asking questions, the reason you'll accept your expanded role when Ms. Vane explains it to you next week. Because the alternative, making noise or trying to involve authorities or becoming a problem that needs solving, that alternative doesn't just affect you. It affects everyone connected to you, everyone you care about, everyone who matters. You're threatening to hurt children. I'm explaining reality. We don't want to hurt anyone, Mr. Kincannon. We want smooth operations, reliable logistics, and personnel who understand their roles and perform them without complications. You provide that, everyone stays safe. You deviate, people get hurt. Simple cause and effect, nothing personal, just business. The line went dead before Boaz could respond. He drove in silence for several miles, hands shaking, breath coming in shallow gasps that he had to consciously slow down before he hyperventilated. The camera was recording this too, capturing his reaction, the trembling hands, the fear written across his face. Evidence that Valle Verde was using threats against his family to ensure compliance. But evidence only mattered if someone was watching who could act on it, and right now Boaz had no confidence that such people existed. He thought about calling Foster immediately, reporting the threat, asking for federal protection for Teresa and the kids. But that would confirm to Valle Verde that he was cooperating with law enforcement, would probably accelerate whatever violence they were planning rather than preventing it. The smart move was to stay quiet, act compliant, continue gathering evidence while hoping Foster's team could move fast enough to disrupt the operation before the threats became actions. South of Zapata, a second vehicle joined the dark sedan behind him. Not the white SUV from previous runs, but a black pickup truck with tinted windows and no visible plates. The two vehicles bracketed him now, one following directly and one offset to the side, moving in coordinated patterns that spoke to training and experience. Professional surveillance, probably former military or law enforcement, people who knew how to track targets and prevent escape attempts. Boaz was boxed in, trapped between the escort vehicles and the knowledge of what his cargo contained, driving toward a destination he didn't want to reach but couldn't avoid. Around midnight, exhaustion started to creep in despite the adrenaline. He'd been running on fear and coffee for days, barely sleeping, constantly vigilant, and his body was demanding rest that he couldn't afford to give it. He forced his eyes to stay open, pinched his arm hard enough to leave marks, anything to stay alert. Falling asleep at the wheel would end this in the worst possible way, a crash that killed him and destroyed the evidence and left Teresa and her kids vulnerable to whatever Valle Verde decided to do. His phone buzzed with a text from Foster Llewellyn. "Passed you at checkpoint. Everything okay?" Boaz stared at the message, thumb hovering over the keyboard. Foster must have been working the checkpoint tonight. Must have seen Boaz come through with the escort vehicles in tow. The agent was reaching out, offering support, reminding him that cooperation was still an option, but responding was dangerous, possibly fatal, if Valle Verde was monitoring his phone communications. The smart move was to ignore the text, maintain radio silence, continue playing the role of compliant driver. Instead, he typed, "Can't talk, being watched. Wednesday they're screening me, polygraph, and financial audit. After that, I'm finished either way." He sent the message before he could reconsider, then immediately regretted it. If Valle Verde saw that communication, if they were intercepting his texts or had access to his phone records, he'd just confirmed their worst suspicions. But maybe that didn't matter anymore. Maybe he was already marked for elimination, and this just moved up the timeline. At least Foster would know, would understand that something was coming, would hopefully be ready to act. 3 dots appeared, Foster typing a response. They disappeared, appeared again, disappeared. Finally, "Don't go to screening. Meet me tomorrow morning, same library, 9 a.m. We can protect you and your family if you cooperate fully. This is your last chance to get out alive." Boaz read the message 3 times, considering options that all seemed bad in different ways. Meet Foster and probably trigger an immediate response from Valle Verde, who were almost certainly monitoring this conversation. Skip the meeting and the Wednesday screening. Run somewhere and hope federal protection could catch up before Valle Verde's people found him. Or show up Wednesday as scheduled, accept whatever was coming, and hope the recording devices Foster had given him would capture enough evidence to matter. He deleted both messages and put the phone away. Decision made. He would continue the charade, would play the role of compliant driver, would walk into Wednesday's screening with recording devices running and let Valle Verde reveal itself through its own actions. It was probably suicide, but it was suicide in service of something bigger than his own survival. The evidence would exist, documented and preserved, ready to burn the operation down even if Boaz didn't live to see it. Rio Grande City appeared ahead, the small town sleeping peacefully beneath scattered streetlights. Boaz remembered the man who'd watched his truck at the fuel stop during that first run, standing in shadows with that predatory stillness. Tonight, he had no intention of stopping, but as he passed the truck stop, he couldn't help glancing over. The lot was mostly empty, just a couple of big rigs parked at the fuel pumps, drivers probably inside paying or grabbing coffee. Normal, late-night scene, nothing threatening. But he knew now that threats weren't always visible, that Valle Verde's people could be anywhere, could look like anyone, could appear as just another driver or mechanic or fuel attendant until the moment they weren't. The black pickup that had been following peeled off at Rio Grande City, disappearing into the town's darkened streets. But the dark sedan remained, maintaining its position behind Boaz's trailer with mechanical precision. One escort was apparently sufficient for this final stretch into McAllen, or maybe the pickup had other tasks to accomplish, other checkpoints to monitor or threats to address. Boaz tried not to think about what those tasks might involve, tried not to imagine the pickup heading north toward Corpus Christi, where Teresa and her kids slept, unaware of the danger circling them. The final 40 miles into McAllen passed in a blur of exhaustion and hypervigilance. Boaz's eyes burned from staring at the road. His shoulders ached from tension that wouldn't release. His jaw hurt from clenching his teeth. When the warehouse district finally appeared on the horizon, sprawling industrial buildings lit by security lights and outlined against the night sky, he felt an exhausted relief so intense it was almost physical. Not relief that the run was over, but relief that he'd made it this far without anything catastrophic happening. Without his truck being pulled over and searched, without the escort vehicles forcing him off the road into some remote location where he'd disappear like so many others. He navigated the familiar streets to the McAllen distribution center, backed his trailer into the same loading dock as before, and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening after hours of road noise and diesel rumble. Boaz sat in the darkness of his cab, breathing slowly, trying to steady his nerves for whatever came next. The camera hidden behind his sun visor continued recording, capturing the loading dock, the warehouse workers approaching, the dark sedan parking in a position that blocked the most direct exit route. The warehouse manager he'd seen on previous runs approached with his clipboard, but tonight he wasn't alone. Accompanying him was a woman Boaz didn't recognize, mid-30s, wearing business casual clothing and an expression that was professionally pleasant but somehow conveyed absolute authority. She gestured for Boaz to roll down his window, and he complied, feeling like a man following a script written by someone else. "Mr. Kincannon, I'm here on behalf of Ms. Vane to personally oversee tonight's delivery." Her voice matched her appearance, professional and controlled, with just a hint of something sharp underneath. She wanted to ensure everything proceeds smoothly and that you're settling into your new schedule comfortably. "Everything's fine," Boaz said, keeping his tone neutral. "Just here to make the delivery." "Of course. The unloading will begin shortly. Ms. Vane has requested that drivers remain in their cabs during cargo handling procedures. It helps maintain chain of custody documentation and prevents any confusion about responsibility if issues arise." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure you understand." What Boaz understood was that he was being explicitly prevented from observing the unloading, kept isolated and blind to what was actually happening to the cargo once it left his trailer. On previous runs, he'd been free to use the warehouse facilities, watch the unloading if he wanted, even help if they were short-handed. Now that freedom was gone, replaced by polite but firm instructions to stay put and stay ignorant. "Understood," he said, rolling the window back up. The woman stepped back and spoke quietly into a radio, and within moments workers appeared to begin the unloading process. Forklifts moved into position, the trailer doors were unsealed and opened, and pallets started moving from Boaz's trailer into the warehouse with efficient speed. He watched in his mirrors, camera recording everything, trying to see details that might reveal what was really being transported. The workers handled the pallets with standard care. Nothing unusual about their movements or procedures. The cargo looked exactly like what the manifest claimed. Produce, wrapped in plastic, stacked neatly on wooden pallets. But Boaz knew now that appearances meant nothing, that horror could be concealed beneath layers of legitimate business, that the true cargo was hidden inside or beneath the visible shipment. 15 minutes into the unloading, something happened that made every nerve in Boaz's body fire at once. One of the forklift operators misjudged a turn, and the pallet he was carrying struck the edge of the trailer door frame. The impact wasn't severe, just a glancing blow, but it was enough to destabilize the load. The pallet tilted, boxes shifted, and several containers tumbled off the forks and hit the concrete warehouse floor. The response was immediate and telling. Workers converged on the spill from every direction, moving with urgent coordination. The woman who'd spoken to Boaz was on her radio instantly, speaking rapid Spanish that he couldn't fully follow from this distance. More personnel appeared, carrying large plastic bins and industrial cleaning supplies. They formed a perimeter around the spill, blocking it from Boaz's view with their bodies while other workers scrambled to recover whatever had fallen. Through gaps in the human wall, Boaz caught glimpses of the cleanup. Produce was scattered across the floor, tomatoes and peppers rolling in different directions. But the workers weren't just gathering vegetables. They were collecting other items too, smaller packages that had apparently been concealed within the produce shipments, containers that had split open on impact and spilled their contents. The camera in Boaz's cab couldn't capture clear details from this angle and distance, but it recorded the frantic response, the obvious urgency, the way supervisors directed workers with terse commands and angry gestures. The cleanup took 20 minutes, far longer than a simple produce spill should have required. Workers scrubbed the floor with chemical cleaners, the sharp smell reaching Boaz even inside his locked cab. Whatever had spilled wasn't just vegetables, wasn't just agricultural products that could be swept up and disposed of normally. It was something that required decontamination, something that left residue that needed to be chemically neutralized. When the woman finally approached Boaz's window again, her professional composure had cracked slightly. Stress lines were visible around her eyes, and her voice carried an edge it hadn't before. A small accident, nothing serious. The unloading will continue shortly. She paused, studying his face intently. I trust you understand that accidents happen in freight operations, that they're routine and not worth discussing or documenting beyond standard incident reports. I didn't see anything worth documenting, Boaz said carefully. Just a dropped pallet and some produce spilling. Happens all the time. The woman's expression relaxed fractionally. Exactly. Ms. Vane appreciates your professionalism and discretion. Your payment for tonight will reflect that appreciation. She walked away, and the unloading resumed. Workers moved the remaining pallets with exaggerated care, every movement deliberate and cautious. Whatever had nearly been exposed by the dropped pallet, they were determined not to risk a repeat incident. Boaz watched it all, camera recording, mind cataloging details and trying to piece together what had actually spilled. The former driver's words echoed again. Organs packed in ice, tissue samples, whatever has value on the black market. Human remains concealed within legitimate shipments, transported in refrigerated containers that masked the smell and provided cover for the real cargo. The unloading finished without further incidents. The warehouse manager brought Boaz the delivery confirmation to sign, and he scrawled his signature mechanically, accepting his complicity in whatever had just been transferred from his trailer into Valle Verde's distribution network. The woman supervised as he secured the trailer doors, watching to ensure he didn't examine the interior too closely, didn't notice details that might raise questions or prompt unwanted curiosity. As Boaz prepared to pull out, she approached his window one final time. Ms. Vane asked me to remind you about your schedule. Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday runs this week, all following the same procedures. And don't forget your meeting with her on Wednesday morning before your scheduled departure. She's looking forward to discussing your future with the organization. Boaz nodded without speaking, not trusting his voice. He started the engine and pulled away from the loading dock, watching the warehouse recede in his mirrors. The dark sedan fell in behind him immediately, resuming its escort position for the return trip to Laredo. Nothing had changed. The surveillance continued, the operation proceeded, and he was still trapped in the middle of it. The drive back passed in exhausted silence. Dawn was breaking as Boaz crossed into Laredo, painting the eastern sky in shades of orange and red that looked like warnings or omens. He pulled into the depot as the day shift was arriving, mechanics and drivers beginning their routines. Everything appearing normal and professional, and completely disconnected from the horror that Boaz had just participated in. Marcus was waiting in the dispatch office with the payment envelope, but he wasn't alone. Two men Boaz had never seen before stood flanking the desk, silent and watchful, wearing dark suits that were too formal for a freight depot. Security, probably, or enforcers or whatever Valle Verde called the people who handled problems that required physical solutions. Their presence transformed the familiar office into something menacing, a space where business could be conducted, but violence was always just beneath the surface. Marcus slid the envelope across the desk without meeting Boaz's eyes. "Good run. No issues reported. Ms. Vane wanted me to confirm your Wednesday morning appointment, 9 a.m., here at the depot. She'll have some personnel matters to discuss with you before your next departure." "I'll be here," Boaz said, taking the envelope. The weight felt heavier than previous payments, possibly because there was more cash inside, possibly because the moral weight of what he was being paid for had become too heavy to ignore. She also wanted me to pass along a reminder. Marcus finally looked up, and something in his expression might have been sympathy or warning or just resignation. We're all part of a team here. Team members trust each other, support each other, don't create complications that affect everyone else's livelihood. You've been a good team member so far, Boaz. Ms. Vane hopes that continues. The two silent men flanking the desk shifted slightly, a subtle repositioning that drew Boaz's attention to them and their obvious purpose. The message was clear. Compliance was expected, deviation would be addressed, and the address would be physical and final. "No complications from me," Boaz said quietly. "I know my role." He left the office and walked across the lot to his truck, feeling the two men's eyes tracking his movement until he climbed into the cab and closed the door. The envelope went into his glove compartment next to Foster Llewellyn's business card, payment and potential salvation sitting side by side. The camera went into the lockbox in his apartment, added to the growing collection of evidence that might matter or might just be documentation of his own descent into complicity. Boaz drove home through morning traffic, surrounded by normal people heading to normal jobs, living normal lives that didn't include knowledge of human trafficking or organ harvesting or the casual evil that flourished along the border. He envied them their ignorance, their ability to move through the world without carrying the weight of what he knew. But that envy was pointless, because he couldn't unknow what he'd learned, couldn't unsee what he'd witnessed, couldn't erase his own participation in Valle Verde's operations. At his apartment, he tried to sleep but couldn't. His mind churned through scenarios, playing out Wednesday's screening in different variations that all ended badly. If Valle Verde's polygraph was competent, they'd detect his deception, discover his contact with Foster, realize he was gathering evidence. If their financial audit was thorough, they'd find traces of his research into their organization, notice the patterns in his movements that suggested surveillance or preparation. Either way, Wednesday would expose him, and then the only questions were how quickly they'd act and whether Foster could intervene before Valle Verde's people made him disappear. He spent Tuesday in a fog of anxiety and preparation, organizing what few affairs he had to organize. He withdrew cash from his legitimate accounts, leaving just enough to avoid triggering bank alerts. He wrote a letter to Teresa explaining everything, sealed it in an envelope with instructions to be opened if anything happened to him, and left it with a neighbor he trusted. He cleaned his apartment methodically, throwing away anything that might implicate other people if Valverde searched the place after he was gone. By evening, his life had been reduced to essentials: clothes, documents, the Glock, and the lockbox containing evidence that might survive him. Tuesday night he barely slept, dozing fitfully between nightmares where he opened his trailer to find it full of bodies, faces he recognized from missing person reports, hands reaching out toward him in silent accusation. He woke repeatedly, heart pounding, checking the time and calculating how many hours remained until Wednesday morning's appointment. Each time, the hours had barely moved, time crawling toward something inevitable and probably fatal. Wednesday morning arrived gray and humid, clouds hanging low and heavy like they were pressed down by the same oppressive weight Boaz felt in his chest. He showered and dressed in clean clothes, trying to appear normal and professional and not at all like a man walking to his own execution. The recording devices Foster had given him were already in place, hidden beneath his clothing. Tiny microphones and transmitters that would capture audio and GPS coordinates throughout whatever happened today. If nothing else, there would be a record, evidence that would survive even if he didn't. He arrived at the depot at 8:45. Early, but not suspiciously so. Marcus was already in the dispatch office, looking even more tired and defeated than usual. He gestured toward the back hallway without speaking, apparently unable or unwilling to pretend that this was just another routine meeting. Boaz followed the gesture, walking down a corridor he'd never accessed before, past storage rooms and break areas that were empty at this hour, until he reached a door marked "Conference Room" in faded letters. Inside, Lucretia Vane was waiting. She sat at the head of a long table, perfectly composed in an expensive business suit, hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. The two men who'd been in the dispatch office Monday morning flanked her, standing against the wall like sentries. On the table in front of Lucretia sat a tablet, several folders, and what looked like polygraph equipment, the sensors and blood pressure cuff arranged neatly on the polished surface. "Boaz, thank you for being punctual. Please sit." She gestured to the chair directly across from her, positioning him with his back to the door and the two men behind him in his peripheral vision. Power dynamics established through simple geography. Boaz sat, hands in his lap, where the recording devices could capture everything said in the room. His heart rate was elevated but not racing, fear controlled through sheer force of will. If he was going to die today, he'd at least die with dignity, with evidence preserved, with some small contribution to bringing down the operation that had killed so many others. "I appreciate your cooperation with this security review," Lucretia began, her voice professionally pleasant. "As our operations expand, we need to ensure that all personnel meet our elevated standards for discretion and reliability. I'm sure you understand." "Of course." "Excellent. Let's begin with financial verification. Our auditing team reviewed your banking records and noticed several large cash deposits over the past 2 weeks. Deposits that exceed what you should have received from your official employment with the freight company. Can you explain those?" Here it was, the first trap. Admitting the deposits came from Valverde confirmed he'd been paid off the books, which created leverage. Denying the deposits existed would be an obvious lie, easily disproven. The only option was to acknowledge the payments and frame them as legitimate. "Those are payments for the runs I've been making, cash, like your organization specified. I deposited some of it because I had bills to pay. And some of it you sent to your sister in Corpus Christi, correct?" "Yes, she's struggling financially. I help when I can." Lucretia nodded, making a note on her tablet. "Family loyalty is admirable, but it creates patterns, Boaz. Financial trails that could potentially interest law enforcement if they were investigating our operations. We prefer drivers who keep their Valle Verde income completely separate from their legitimate finances, who understand the importance of maintaining clean documentation. I understand. I can adjust how I handle payments going forward. Good. That brings us to the next matter. Our surveillance team noticed some irregularities in your movements over the past week. Specifically, a trip to Ensenal where you met with someone we've been monitoring, someone who used to work for Valle Verde before he decided our arrangement wasn't to his liking. Want to tell me about that conversation? Boaz felt his stomach drop, but forced his expression to stay neutral. They'd been watching the whole time, had documented his meeting with the former driver, knew he'd been seeking information. The recording devices captured his response and Lucretia's question, preserving evidence of Valle Verde's surveillance capabilities. He contacted me, said he wanted to warn me about something, give me advice about working for your organization. I listened, but I didn't take any actions based on what he said. And what did he say? That Valle Verde is dangerous to work for, that drivers who ask questions tend to disappear, that I should document everything and create insurance for myself. Boaz paused, making a decision to push back slightly and see how she reacted. Basically, he told me the same things you've been telling me, just from the perspective of someone who got out instead of someone running the operation. Lucretia's eyes narrowed fractionally, the first crack in her professional composure. Did he make any specific allegations about what we transport? Any claims about the nature of our cargo? He made claims. I didn't believe them because they seemed paranoid and extreme. People who quit jobs tend to justify their decisions by villainizing their former employers. I assumed he was doing that. It was a careful answer, acknowledging the meeting without confirming belief in what the former driver had said. Lucretia studied him for a long moment, apparently trying to determine if he was lying. The recording devices captured her scrutiny, the silence stretching between them, the weight of decisions being made about whether Boaz was salvageable or had become a problem requiring permanent solutions. The polygraph will help clarify your truthfulness, she said finally. But before we begin that process, I want to address one more concern. Our technical team noticed that you've been researching Valle Verde agricultural distributors online, searching for business records, looking into ownership structures, checking for news articles about our operations. That kind of curiosity suggests you're not fully comfortable with your role in our organization. Want to explain what you were looking for? Another trap. Admitting to research confirmed his suspicions and made him a threat. Denying it would be contradicted by browsing history they'd obviously accessed somehow, either through malware on his computer or cooperation from his internet provider. Boaz made a split-second decision to own the research but frame it innocently. I wanted to understand who I was working for. After 15 years driving for legitimate companies, suddenly I'm making runs for an organization I'd never heard of, getting paid cash, being followed by escort vehicles. That made me curious about whether Valle Verde was legitimate or whether I was getting involved in something illegal. The research reassured me that you're a real company with proper documentation, which made me more comfortable continuing the work. And what would you have done if the research had shown something concerning? Honestly, probably kept driving anyway because I need the money and because walking away seemed more dangerous than staying. But I wanted to know what I was getting into. Lucretia appeared to consider this, weighing his answer against whatever intelligence they'd gathered about his activities. That's fair. Due diligence is understandable, even commendable to a point. The problem is when due diligence crosses into investigation, when drivers start seeing themselves as informants rather than employees. We've had issues with that in the past. Drivers who convinced themselves they were heroes for cooperating with law enforcement. Those situations never end well, Boaz. Not for the drivers, not for anyone connected to them. The threat was clear, barely even veiled. Boaz kept his expression neutral, didn't react, just sat waiting for whatever came next. The recording devices captured Lucretia's words, preserving evidence of the intimidation, even if Valle Verde's lawyers would later claim it was just general discussion of company policy. "Let's proceed with the polygraph," Lucretia said, pulling the equipment closer. "Standard questions. Nothing invasive. Have you ever stolen from the company? Have you discussed Valle Verde's operations with law enforcement? Do you intend to continue working for us reliably? Simple yes or no answers. The machine will indicate if you're being truthful." This was it, the moment where everything would likely come apart. Boaz couldn't pass questions about law enforcement contact because he'd met with Foster, had recording devices on his body right now, was actively gathering evidence. The polygraph would show deception. Lucretia would know he was compromised, and then violence would follow. The two men behind him would move, the conference room door would lock, and Boaz would disappear like so many others. Unless Foster's team was close enough to intervene. Unless they were monitoring his GPS coordinates and had positioned arrest teams nearby. Unless the federal law enforcement apparatus could move fast enough to save him before Valle Verde's enforcers finished what they'd started. Boaz extended his arm for the blood pressure cuff, accepting the inevitable. "Let's get started." Lucretia attached the sensors with practiced efficiency, her fingers cold against his skin. The equipment powered on, baseline measurements establishing his normal heart rate and breathing patterns. The machine hummed softly, recording physiological responses that would betray any attempt at deception. "First question," Lucretia said, watching both Boaz and the machine's readouts. "Have you ever discussed Valle Verde's operations with anyone outside the organization?" Yes. Technically true, because he'd talked to Teresa about the job in vague terms, had mentioned Valle Verde to the mechanic who serviced his truck. The machine registered the truthful answer. "Have you had any contact with law enforcement regarding Valle Verde specifically?" This was the trap question, the one designed to expose his cooperation with Foster. Boaz took a slow breath, aware that the recording devices were capturing everything, that this moment would either condemn him or provide crucial evidence. "Yes." Lucretia's expression froze, surprise flickering across her face before professional control reasserted itself. "Explain." "Border Patrol agents have inspected my cargo at checkpoints multiple times. Federal regulations require cooperation with law enforcement during those inspections. If that counts as contact, then yes, I've had contact." It was technically accurate, a literal interpretation of the question that avoided the deeper truth about Foster, but the polygraph measured physiological stress, not technical accuracy. The machine's readouts showed elevated heart rate, increased perspiration, signs of deception or anxiety. Lucretia studied the graphs, her expression hardening. "That's not what I'm asking, and you know it. Have you met with law enforcement outside of routine checkpoint inspections? Have you provided them with information about Valle Verde's operations? Have you agreed to cooperate with any investigation?" The three questions came rapid fire, designed to overwhelm and provoke honest reactions. Boaz felt sweat breaking out across his forehead, his heart hammering against his ribs. The recording devices captured Lucretia's interrogation, documenting the pressure and the threats implicit in her tone. Before he could answer, the conference room door burst open. Federal agents in tactical gear flooded in, weapons raised, voices shouting commands. "Federal agents! Hands where we can see them! Nobody move!" Lucretia's hand darted toward something beneath the table, but agents were on her before she could reach it, forcing her down, securing her wrists with zip ties. The two men behind Boaz tried to resist and were tackled instantly, slammed face first into the floor with enough force to crack the tile. More agents poured through the door, spreading through the depot, securing personnel and equipment. Foster Llewellyn appeared in the doorway, badge held high, eyes scanning the room until he found Boaz still sitting in the chair with the polygraph sensors attached. "You all right?" Boaz couldn't speak, couldn't process what was happening. He just nodded, hands shaking as he pulled off the blood pressure cuff and sensors. The room filled with federal agents, Border Patrol and FBI and DEA, all moving with coordinated precision that spoke to extensive planning and surveillance. "We've been monitoring your GPS and audio for the past hour," Foster said, helping Boaz to his feet. "When your heart rate spiked and we heard Lucretia pushing you about law enforcement contact, we moved. You did good, Boaz. The recordings you made over the past week, combined with what we captured today, it's enough for warrants across the entire network." Through the conference room door, Boaz could see the depot in chaos. Agents were securing vehicles, detaining workers, photographing everything. Marcus was being led out in handcuffs, head down, not resisting. Other drivers stood confused, some protesting innocence, others accepting arrest with resignation. The entire operation was being dismantled in real time, years of Valle Verde's carefully constructed infrastructure collapsing in minutes. "What about my family?" Boaz asked, finding his voice. "Teresa and the kids, are they safe?" "Federal marshals are with them right now. They're being relocated to protective custody, new identities, complete insulation from any retaliation." Foster guided Boaz toward the door, through the chaos of the ongoing raid. "You're going with them, new name, new city, new life. It's the only way to keep you safe from what's left of Valle Verde's organization." Boaz let himself be led outside into bright morning sunlight that seemed wrong somehow, too normal for the moment. His truck sat where he'd parked it hours ago, surrounded now by federal agents documenting everything, photographing the exterior, preparing to search the interior and trailer for evidence. 15 years he'd driven that Peterbilt, crossed hundreds of thousands of miles, hauled countless loads. Now it was just evidence, another piece of property to be seized and examined, and eventually auctioned off to strangers. A federal vehicle waited to transport him to wherever protective custody began. Boaz climbed in, watching through tinted windows as agents swarmed the depot. Lucretia Vane was being loaded into a separate transport, still composed even in restraints, probably already planning legal strategies and calculating which subordinates could be sacrificed to protect higher-level operators. People like her survived through layers of insulation and plausible deniability. The raid would damage Valle Verde's operations, but probably wouldn't destroy the organization entirely. The vehicle pulled away from the depot, heading toward whatever came next. Foster sat in the front passenger seat, occasionally speaking into a radio, coordinating with other teams executing simultaneous raids across South Texas. Warehouses, distribution centers, border crossing points, all being hit at once in an operation designed to maximize disruption and evidence collection. "How long were you watching me?" Boaz asked quietly. Foster turned to face him. "Since the first night you made contact. We had surveillance on the depot, on Valle Verde's known properties, on key personnel. When you showed up on our radar as a new regular driver, we started monitoring you more closely. The recording devices we gave you helped, but we were already tracking your movements and documenting the organization's activities. So I was bait. You used me to map the network. You were a cooperative witness who helped us build an airtight case. There's a difference." Foster paused. "I know it doesn't feel like victory right now, but what you did matters. The cargo we seized from your trailer last night contained human remains from 14 people." 14 families who'll get answers now, who'll be able to bury their loved ones instead of wondering forever what happened. That's because of you, Boaz. Because you had the courage to gather evidence instead of just walking away. 14 people. The number hit Boaz like a physical blow. He'd hauled the remains of 14 murdered human beings, delivered them to Valle Verde's distribution network where they'd been processed and sold. The nausea that had been his constant companion for weeks rose again, and this time he couldn't force it down. He leaned forward, dry heaving, nothing left in his stomach to expel but bile and horror. The trials will be hard, Foster continued quietly. You'll have to testify, relive all of this in courtrooms while defense attorneys try to discredit you. Some defendants will take plea deals and cooperate. Others will fight every charge. It'll take years to work through the legal system, and Valle Verde's organization will try to retaliate even from prison. That's why protective custody is permanent. You can't go back to your old life, can't contact old friends, can't be Boaz Kincannon anymore. Who will I be? Someone new. The marshals will help you build a new identity, new background, new everything. Teresa and her kids, too. You'll all be relocated together, but separately. Close enough to maintain contact, but not so close that finding one of you leads to the others. Foster handed him a folder. This has preliminary information. Read it. Start thinking about what kind of person you want to become. It's not often people get a chance to completely reinvent themselves. Boaz opened the folder mechanically, scanning documents about relocation procedures and identity construction. New name, new social security number, new employment history. Everything carefully crafted to create a person who'd never driven trucks along the South Texas border, who'd never worked for Valle Verde, who'd never been complicit in human trafficking. A clean slate purchased through testimony and cooperation, leaving behind everything he'd been for 15 years. 3 months later, Boaz sat in a safe house somewhere in the upper Midwest, surrounded by federal agents preparing him for his first trial testimony. The legal machinery had been grinding forward, indictments handed down, defendants arraigned, discovery processes beginning. Some of Valle Verde's operators had flipped immediately, providing testimony about the organization's structure in exchange for reduced sentences. Others were fighting, hiring expensive lawyers, filing motions to suppress evidence and discredit witnesses. Lucretia Vane was fighting. Her attorneys had filed dozens of motions, challenging everything from the constitutionality of the raid to the admissibility of the recordings Boaz had made. They were building a defense based on entrapment and improper surveillance, arguing that federal agents had coerced Boaz into gathering evidence without proper authorization. It probably wouldn't work, the recordings were too damning, but they'd make the trials expensive and difficult. Teresa and the kids were safe, relocated under new identities to a city Boaz wasn't allowed to know about. He'd said goodbye through a video call that lasted 15 minutes, watching them try to be brave while their lives were torn apart. Miguel had cried, not understanding why Uncle Boaz couldn't visit anymore. Sophia had just stared at the screen, confused and hurt. Teresa had been strongest, thanking him for trying to do right even though the cost was devastating. The former driver who'd warned Boaz at Ensenal had been found dead 3 weeks after the raids. Official cause of death was listed as suicide. Single gunshot to the head. No signs of struggle. But Boaz knew better. Valle Verde's reach extended beyond arrests and trials, beyond imprisonment and federal protection. The organization was settling accounts, eliminating loose ends, sending messages to anyone who might consider cooperation. Foster visited occasionally, updating Boaz on trial preparations and investigation progress. The cargo seized from Boaz's final runs had been analyzed, DNA extracted, identities confirmed. 16 people total, not 14 like Foster had initially estimated. 16 human beings who'd crossed the border hoping for better lives and instead been murdered, dismembered, reduced to commodities in Valleverde's trafficking network. 16 families who finally had answers, even if those answers were unbearable. The first trial starts next month, Foster said during one visit, sitting across from Boaz in the safe house's cramped living room. Lucretia Vane and 4 of her lieutenants, charged with conspiracy to commit murder, human trafficking, and racketeering. You'll be testifying for probably 3 days, maybe longer if the defense cross-examination is aggressive. Will I be safe in the courthouse? We'll have security, but I can't guarantee complete safety. Valleverde still has resources, still has connections. The marshals will do everything possible to protect you, but there's always risk. Foster leaned forward, expression serious. You can still back out, refuse to testify, stay in protective custody indefinitely without participating in the trials. It's your choice. What happens if I don't testify? Some defendants might walk on reduced charges. The evidence is strong, but your testimony ties everything together, provides the narrative that juries need to understand how the organization operated. Without you, some people who deserve life sentences might get 10 years instead. Boaz thought about the 16 people whose remains he'd transported, about their families waiting for justice, about all the future victims who'd be spared if Valleverde's organization was truly dismantled. I'll testify. I owe them that much. The trial began on a cold morning in federal court. Security heavy enough that the building felt like a fortress. Boaz was transported in an unmarked vehicle, surrounded by marshals, entering through a secure entrance away from public access. The courtroom was packed with media, victims' families, law enforcement observers. Lucretia Vane sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, looking calm and confident, like someone who'd never doubted she'd walk free. Boaz's testimony lasted 4 days, not 3. He recounted every run he'd made for Valleverde, described the surveillance and threats, explained how he'd gathered evidence and cooperated with federal agents. The prosecution led him through a careful narrative, building the case methodically. The defense attacked from every angle, trying to paint him as an unreliable witness motivated by immunity deals and witness protection benefits. Isn't it true, Mr. Kincannon, that you only cooperated with law enforcement after you'd already been paid thousands of dollars for hauling what you knew to be human remains? The defense attorney was aggressive, trying to rattle him. I cooperated after I discovered what I was hauling. The payments weren't relevant to my decision. But you kept the money, didn't you? Profited from your participation in this alleged trafficking network. The money was seized as evidence. I didn't keep anything except my life. The exchanges went on for hours, defense attorneys probing for inconsistencies or contradictions that might undermine his credibility. Boaz stuck to the truth, answered every question carefully, refused to be provoked into angry responses that could be used against him. It was exhausting, degrading, but necessary. The jury deliberated for 6 days before returning verdicts. Lucretia Vane, guilty on all counts. Her lieutenants, guilty on most counts. Hung jury on a few lesser charges. Sentences would be handed down later, but conviction on federal racketeering and human trafficking charges meant decades in prison minimum, possibly life for the most serious defendants. Boaz watched the verdicts being read from a secure viewing room, seeing Lucretia's composure finally crack as the jury foreman announced guilty for the 18th time. She'd lost, her organization was crippled, and she'd spend the rest of her life in federal prison. It should have felt like victory, like justice being served. Instead, it just felt hollow, a conclusion to something that had destroyed too many lives to ever be made right. More trials followed over the next year. mid-level operators, corrupt officials, logistics coordinators. Some pleaded guilty and cooperated, others fought and lost. The evidence Boaz and others had gathered was too comprehensive, too well documented to overcome. Valle Verde's South Texas network was dismantled piece by piece. Hundreds of arrests, dozens of convictions. But Boaz knew the organization hadn't been destroyed, just disrupted. Other networks would fill the vacuum. Other traffickers would adapt Valle Verde's methods. Other drivers would be recruited to haul cargo they didn't understand until it was too late. The border would continue to be what it had always been, a place where desperate people encountered predatory systems, where human suffering became profitable, where good intentions collided with brutal reality. 2 years after the raids, Boaz sat in a small apartment in a city he still couldn't name publicly, living under a name that still didn't feel like his own. He worked construction now, union job with decent pay, completely separate from trucking and freight and anything that might connect him to his former life. The people he worked with knew him as someone who'd moved here for a fresh start, someone escaping a bad divorce or failed business. They didn't know about Valle Verde, about the trials, about the 16 people whose remains he'd hauled across South Texas. Teresa and the kids were doing okay, according to the occasional supervised communications the marshals allowed. Miguel was adjusting to his new school. Sophia had made friends in her new neighborhood. Teresa had found work teaching at a local community college. They had new names, too, new identities. New lives built on the foundation of federal protection and deliberate amnesia about everything before. Sometimes Boaz dreamed about driving, about long, empty highways stretching toward horizons he'd never reach. In those dreams, his trailer was always full of cargo he couldn't see, weight he could feel but never verify, sealed containers that leaked dark fluid onto the road behind him. He'd wake gasping, checking his hands for stains that weren't there, reassuring himself that he wasn't behind the wheel anymore, that he'd gotten out, that the evidence he'd gathered had mattered. But he knew the dreams would never stop entirely, that he'd carry Valle Verde with him for the rest of his life. The price of doing the right thing, of trying to stop something bigger than himself, was permanent displacement and permanent vigilance. He'd traded his identity for a chance at justice, gambled everything on the hope that exposing Valle Verde might save future victims. Whether that gamble had been worth it, he honestly couldn't say. On good days, he thought about the 16 families who'd gotten answers, about the lives potentially saved by dismantling the trafficking network. On bad days, he thought about Teresa's kids crying on that video call, about the former driver found dead with a bullet in his head, about his own reflection in the mirror that looked like a stranger. Late one night, the phone rang. His secure line, the one only federal marshals and certain law enforcement personnel had access to. He answered, expecting an update about trial scheduling or security protocols. Boaz Kincannon? Female voice, unfamiliar, professional. His blood ran cold at the use of his real name. Who is this? Someone who knows what you did. Someone who wants you to know that Valle Verde hasn't forgotten. We're patient. We can wait as long as necessary, and when the time is right, when your handlers stop watching so carefully, we'll settle our accounts. The line went dead. Boaz sat holding the phone, fear flooding back with crushing intensity. They'd found him already, penetrated whatever security the marshals had established, made contact to remind him that he'd never truly be safe. The trials might have imprisoned some of Valle Verde's operators, but the organization itself continued, adapting and evolving, patient and vengeful. He called his marshal handler immediately, reported the threat, requested enhanced security. The response was efficient and professional. New phone, new security protocols, investigation into how his contact information had been compromised. But Boaz knew it wouldn't matter. If Valle Verde could find him once, they could find him again, and again, and again, until eventually they succeeded, or he died of old age, whichever came first. That was his future now, looking over his shoulder perpetually, wondering if every stranger was the one Valle Verde had sent to collect their debt. The legal victories had been real, the convictions meaningful, the operation disrupted significantly. But Valle Verde's reach was longer than federal protection, their patience deeper than witness security protocols, their commitment to revenge stronger than any safeguards the government could provide. Boaz understood now what the former driver had tried to tell him at Encinal. There was no clean exit from Valle Verde's network, no safe ending for anyone who opposed them. The best you could hope for was to survive longer than they expected, gather enough insurance to make killing you more costly than letting you live, create enough leverage to buy years instead of months. He'd done his part, testified in multiple trials, helped to secure dozens of convictions. 16 families had gotten closure. Future victims had potentially been spared. The price for that was his identity, his career, his relationship with his family, and his peace of mind. Whether the trade was worth it depended on which moment you asked him. On good days, when the sun was shining and the nightmares had faded, and Teresa's supervised emails talked about Miguel's good grades and Sophia's soccer team, Boaz could convince himself he'd made the right choice. That stopping Valle Verde, even temporarily, even partially, justified the end. That being a witness instead of a perpetrator was the only moral path available to him. On bad days when the dreams were vivid and the threats felt immediate and the weight of displacement crushed down on him, he wondered if he should have just kept driving, taken the money, delivered the cargo, looked the other way, lived with guilt instead of fear, compromised morally rather than sacrificing everything. But those were false choices, really. There was no version of this story where Boaz Kincannon kept his old life intact. The moment he'd taken that first envelope of cash from Valle Verde, the moment he'd agreed to make that first run, his future had forked into different flavors of destruction. Complicity or testimony, guilt or displacement, slow moral corrosion or sudden violent upheaval. He'd chosen testimony, chosen displacement, chosen to live with fear rather than guilt. And now he'd live with that choice for however many years remained, whether that was decades or whether Valle Verde's patient revenge arrived tomorrow. The phone didn't ring again that night, but Boaz knew it would eventually. They'd make contact periodically, reminding him they hadn't forgotten, maintaining psychological pressure even if physical violence wasn't immediately practical. That was how organizations like Valle Verde operated, through patient intimidation, through the slow erosion of security and sanity, through the certainty that escape was an illusion and safety was temporary. Boaz turned off the lights in his small apartment and sat in the darkness, listening to traffic sounds from the street below. Normal city noise, people living normal lives, unaware that a former trucker who'd testified against human traffickers was sitting 3 floors above them, waiting for violence that might come tonight or might come in 10 years. This was his life now. This was what doing the right thing had cost him, and he'd make the same choice again if he had to, because the alternative was unthinkable, because 16 families deserved answers, because future victims deserved whatever protection his testimony could provide. But he'd never stop looking over his shoulder. Never stop checking locks and scanning crowds and wondering if today was the day Valle Verde's patience ran out. That was the price of justice, paid in full forever.